Release Zealot.
Reza Aslan, where does the phrase "no God but God" come from?
It's the first half of the Muslim profession of faith called the Shahada. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is God's messenger. It's essentially the phrase that initiates a convert into the Muslim faith.
You also write in that book, "No God but God," but now Islam is available to all Muslims, and every Muslim can speak for Islam.
Yeah, it's a strange phenomenon because, and it's what I refer to as the Islamic Reformation, because Islam, though it's not a priestly religion, it has, it's more like rabbinical in a sense, that there are a whole host of different schools of law and interpretations, and certain individuals who, because of a lifetime of learning, have achieved a level of knowledge that allows them to speak authoritatively about Islamic theology, Islamic jurisprudence. But as with Judaism, those individuals don't have authority over one another. Just as many Jews would say, you get 4 rabbis in a room and you'll have 5 opinions about something. The same is true about imams. So it's a religion that tries to not have an intermediary between the individual and God, and yet, because, again, like Judaism, it's a legalistic religion, it has resulted in the creation of this class of scholars, the ulama, the learned ones as they're known, who have maintained a monopoly over the meaning and message of Islam for most of the last 14 centuries.
How did that evolve from Muhammad into a freedom to interpret?
It's interesting. This, in many ways, is the same process that all great religions go through. You have a prophet who is primarily a reformer, not a creator of a religion. I think that's the very important thing for people to understand. We have this misperception that what a prophet is somebody who invents a new religion, but that's not what a prophet is. A prophet is someone who reforms the religion and the cultural and social milieu in which he lives. Jesus, for instance, did not create Christianity. Jesus was a Jew preaching about Judaism. The Buddha did not create Buddhism. The Buddha was a Hindu. He was reforming Hinduism. And the same is true of the Prophet Muhammad, as the Quran repeatedly reminds people, this is not a new religion. This is the same message that was given to all the prophets that came before Muhammad, etc., etc. But what happens is that eventually the prophet passes. And now it's the responsibility of the prophet's followers to figure out a way to make sense of the words and actions of this prophet, and that's when religion is first founded. And religion as a man-made institution requires a power structure. And who becomes in charge of that religion? Well, first it's the prophet's initial followers, and then it's the second generation, and then that power structure is based not so much on whether you knew the prophet or not, but on how much knowledge you can accumulate about the traditions, the theology that was espoused by the prophet, and hence these massive institutions that we see of religion. Now, if you follow that timeline on, it doesn't take a long time for individuals to start complaining about that institution and to start recognizing that there's a bit of a gap between what the institution has to say and what the prophet had to say. And that's when you have this grand clash between individuals and institutions that happens in all great religious traditions over who gets to define faith. The term that scholars use for that clash is reformation.
And in No God But God, you write that religion is, by definition, interpretation, and by definition, all investigations, all interpretations are valid. How does that play out in the contemporary Middle East, especially what's going on in Iraq, some of the conflicts?
People don't like that saying, what I said there. But religious people don't like it. Religious people like to think that there is one version of Christianity, one version of Islam, one version of of Judaism, and it's their version, correct? But of course, the problem is that when you are confronted with sacred scriptures, what you have in front of you doesn't really exist in a vacuum. I mean, really, scripture without interpretation, it's just words on a page. That's all it is. It requires someone to encounter it and interpret it. And in doing so, one cannot help but bring one's own preconceived notions, one's political and economic and social views. Why are there 1,000 different versions of Christianity, thousands of different versions of Islam? Precisely for that reason. And so as interpretation, it becomes very difficult to say this interpretation is wrong and this interpretation is right. Now, I do want to say one very important thing. You can say that one particular interpretation is more reasonable. You can say that it's more historically accurate. But there's a reason why in this country's history, just a couple of hundred years ago, both slave owners and abolitionists not only used the same Bible to argue their differing viewpoints, they used the exact same verses to argue their different viewpoints. That's the power of Scripture. That's the power of religion. Now, in an institutionalized religion, one in which there is an authority structure, a papacy, what have you, whatever you want to call it, that has a complete monopoly over the interpretation of faith, then you can maintain a level of control. I mean, the Pope can actually say to a Catholic theologian, you are wrong. Your interpretation is incorrect. And indeed, if you continue to pursue your interpretation, I will excommunicate you, and you are no longer a part of this community. There is nothing like that in Islam, or in Judaism, for that matter. There is no centralized religious authority. And what that means is that anything goes. Any interpretation is now a valid interpretation. There is no one. There's no referee. There's no one to say, you're wrong and you're right. And so it becomes a great shouting match. Again, I keep paralleling Judaism and Islam. The problem, of course, is that there are about 15 million Jews, so it is an argument that is happening, not at the same global stage that you have the 1.5 billion Muslims having this argument. But when you look at the conflicts in the Middle East, when you have Muslim Democrats and Muslim autocrats are fighting against each other, Muslim peacemakers and Muslim war makers arguing against each other, what you are seeing is precisely the result of this reformation process, this individualization of Islam, the process whereby the authority to define this faith is being removed, seized, I should say, from the hands of these institutions that have gripped it for most of the last 14 centuries and are now being led by any individual with a megaphone.
Reza Aslan, what are the similarities between the Talmud, the Quran, and the Bible?
Well, there are, I think, two ways to answer that question. Mythically, they are very much representative of a single prophetic history. In other words, what you are seeing is an understanding that prophetic consciousness, if I can use that phrase, is something that can be passed on from prophet to prophet, from Adam to Moses, from Adam to Abraham to Moses to Jesus to the Prophet Muhammad. That's certainly the way that the Quran presents it. The Quran really sees Islam and the Prophet Muhammad as a continuation, and indeed in this case a seal of a prophetic consciousness that is just sort of moving along through history, a sort of a historical account of God's self-revelation to humanity. That's one sort of the mythic element. Certainly the values and the mores are almost identical. The notion of man's responsibility to man, the idea of the relationship between creator and creation, the duty that humanity has towards the Creator, to worship, to praise, to obey. Concepts of an afterlife are very similar. Concepts of the cosmos are very similar. But I think more importantly, what you see with these three religions is a desperate attempt to, I guess I would say, bring the expanse between humanity and God closer together. There is this sort of mythic quality that God is physically apart from us, right? He's up in the heavens. He is the highest God. And I guess if you want to put it in its simplest way, the history of religions, be it the monotheistic Abrahamic religions or not, the history of religions is predicated upon this long, arduous attempt to create less of a distance between God and humanity, to bring this gap to a close. In many ways, that's what Jesus represents as the incarnate God. It's an attempt to say that there is no gap between humanity and God because God became a human, which is why I think Christianity is so profoundly successful as a global religion. But I think these three religions, these Abrahamic faiths, are intimately intertwined, mythically, historically, morally, really.
Can these three texts be read as political books?
It's a very good question. And I'm going to answer it in a different way. I think this notion that religion and politics are separate things is a very new idea. I think it's important to understand that religion, and I'm talking about all religion in all parts of the world, is far more a matter of identity than it is a matter of beliefs and practices. Let me give you an example of what I mean by this. According to the Pew Forum, about 7 out of 10 Americans self-identify as Christian. Let's think about that for a moment, shall we? 7 out of 10 Americans? Really? 7 out of 10 Americans go to church on Sunday? 7 out of 10 Americans read the Bible on a regular basis, let alone actually follow its precepts? 7 out of 10 Americans can tell you anything about Jesus except that he was born in a manger and died on a cross? Of course not. The vast majority of that 70%, when they say, I am a Christian, are not making so much a faith declaration, they are making a statement of identity. It's about who they are as individuals, how they see themselves in an indeterminate world. And as a matter of identity, your religion subsumes your politics, your economic views, your social views. That has always been the case, and it's still the case now. We only pretend that religion and politics are separate things, but they are not. They are very much a part of the same multifaceted identity that individuals espouse. And with regard to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and certainly with Buddhism and Hindus and everything else, it's a very important thing to recognize that the phrase, I am a Jew, I am a Christian, I am a Muslim, has less to do with these are the things that I believe, these are the rituals that I follow, than it does with this is how I see myself as a person, this is how I understand my role in the world and my relationship to the Creator.
As far as Muhammad was concerned, you write in No God But God, the Jews and the Christians were people of the book, spiritual cousins, who, as opposed to the pagans and polytheists of Arabia, worshipped the same God, read the same scriptures, and shared the same moral values as his Muslim community. Muhammad aligned his community with the Jews in Medina because he considered them, as well as the Christians, to be part of his ummah. What is ummah?
Ummah is a word that means community. And it's really a word that the early Muslim community kind of made up. We're not exactly sure where the word came from. It may be Hebrew, it may be Aramaic. Nobody really knows. But there was no way for the early Muslim community to define the kind of new group, the church that they were trying to create. Because really, if you think about it, in 6th, 7th century Arabia, there was only two possible ways to organize yourself. Either monarchy, which is something that the Arabs had a great distaste for, or tribe. Those were your choices. Neither of those things worked for the Muslim community. And certainly tribe was too limiting, because you can't convert to a tribe. You can't join a tribe. You just have to be born in to a tribe. And so the Ummah was a way to kind of create a new way of understanding what social organization could mean. A social organization based on religious identification. And perhaps the most surprising aspect about the way that the Prophet Muhammad and the early Muslim community viewed this new social organization is that it was inclusive of other monotheistic faiths, not polytheistic faiths. If you were a pagan, if you worshipped other gods, you were an outsider, you did not belong. But if you were what the Quran calls people of the book, Ahlul Kitab, which by which it meant Jews and Christians, and it also included, believe it or not, Zoroastrians in that group, then they saw you as part of this larger community, as part of this ummah. And that, I think, is really unique in the history of religions. In fact, the Quran refers to something called the Kitab, the book, the mother of books. Basically, this is what it's saying, is that there is this kind of heavenly text, this heavenly scripture seated in God, a physical book in heaven with God, from which all scriptures of the world come. And so, in other words, if you take all the scriptures of the world, the Torah, the Gospels, the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, the Rig Veda, the Gathas, and you combine them all together, you get this one heavenly book. That's quite a remarkable statement for a scripture to make, because not only is it validating other scriptures, but it's saying something quite unique, that all these religions are intimately connected. The Quran says something along the lines of, God could have given you one prophet and one scripture if he wanted to, but he chose to make you into different communities, quote, so that you may know one another. Now, this notion of Jews and Christians as fellow believers did not last much longer after the Prophet Muhammad's death. And within about a generation or so, the scriptural scholars, the ulama that I was referring to, very quickly transformed Jews and Christians into unbelievers and really separated Islam from its parent religion as a way of creating independence, if you will. In other words, what they believed was that the Quran annulled the previous scriptures. But that's not what the Quran ever says. The Quran says that it completes the other scriptures, but it sees those scriptures as part and parcel of this larger mother of books in heaven. Quite unusual in the history of religions.
And one more quote from No God But God, before we get into your other books. All religions are inextricably bound to the social, spiritual, and cultural milieu from which they arose and which they are developed. It is not the prophets who create religions. Prophets are, above all, reformers who redefine and reinterpret the existing beliefs and practices of their communities, providing fresh sets of symbols and metaphors with which succeeding generations can describe the nature of reality. Indeed, it is most often the prophet's successors who take upon themselves the responsibility of fashioning their master's words and deeds into unified, easily comprehensible religious systems. Like so many prophets before him, you write, Muhammad never claimed to have invented a new religion.
Right. And again, it's people of religion who have the biggest problem with that kind of notion. First, because of course they want to believe that their religious ideas, their values, their interpretation can be linked directly to the prophet, whether it be Muhammad or Moses or Jesus or the Buddha or what have you. And that is rarely the case. But most importantly, I think, because people of religion want to believe that their religious views are static, that they are monolithic. You hear this a lot, of course, in large religions with multiple sects like Christianity and Islam. Muslims and Christians like to say that their particular Christianity, their particular Islam is the correct one and all the other ones are incorrect. But when you study the world's religions, you understand very, very quickly that there is no such thing as correct religion. There is no such thing as Islam. There is no such thing as Christianity. There are only Christianities and Islams, and that there are almost infinite varieties throughout history in the beliefs and practices, the interpretations of these religions, and that each one of these varieties is inextricably tied to the cultural milieu, the political milieu out of which they arise. Islam, I think, is important. By the way, what I find really unusual about what I'm saying right now is that most rational-minded people would say, well, of course, that sounds true. I mean, when you think about Christianity, of course there are 100 ways of understanding Christianity. But then when you make the same statement about Islam, they say, oh, no, Islam, there's only one version of Islam. Islam is monolithic. But of course, Islam, like Christianity, comes in every flavor that you can imagine. Take a plane from New York to London, from London to Baghdad, from Baghdad to Istanbul, from Istanbul to Jakarta, from Jakarta to Addis Ababa, and you will never see the same Islam twice.
Who was the historic Muhammad?
The Prophet Muhammad was a fascinating character. He belonged to a very small, fairly insignificant clan, which was a part of an enormous and extremely significant and wealthy tribe. So, if you will, he was part of this kind of ruling system, but an outcast in that ruling system. He was an orphan in a society in which orphans had no real protection whatsoever. A society that was deeply stratified between the very wealthy and the poor. And he had sort of figured out through his own, social and business acumen how to become a very successful merchant. In other words, by the time that he became around 40 years old, he had figured out a way to use this religio-political system that had amassed an enormous amount of wealth at the very top to his own benefit, to his own advantage. He seems to have been a deeply spiritual man, though his spirituality was very much steeped in the pagan polytheistic culture out of which he arose, something that a lot of Muslims don't like to think about, that Muhammad was a part of his society, that he was a product of his world, that he didn't just drop from heaven and live in a vacuum for 40 years before he became a prophet. But eventually that spiritual longing led him to have a series of ecstatic experiences in which he claims to have had direct messages from God condemning the economic disparity, the social disparity in his society. And you notice I keep using these terms, economic and social disparity, because the fascinating thing about the Prophet Muhammad's message is, at least in the first decade or so in which he was receiving these revelations, they had very little to do with theological or legalistic concerns. They were overwhelmingly a condemnation of the wealthy and the powerful, a promise of judgment to those who exploit the poor and the marginalized, the weak, the dispossessed, a commandment to protect those who cannot protect themselves, the orphans, the widows, those who had been left behind by this mass accumulation of wealth. And what's, I think, very important for people to understand, and again, this is something that Muslims just sort of have a hard time recognizing, because they like to think of the Prophet Muhammad as purely a religious figure, someone who came with this brand new idea that there is only one God, which was not brand new at all. I mean, every Arab in the Arabian Peninsula had heard this message 1,000 times. One thing that I write about in the book, and that which I think is new to a lot of Muslims, is that the pre-Islamic Arabia was a land that was awash in religions. There were hundreds of Christian groups and Jewish groups and Zoroastrian groups and another group of pre-Islamic monotheists called the Hanifs, all of whom believed that there was only one God. And in fact, the pagan Arabs themselves more or less believed that there was only one God. They just thought that that God was just inaccessible, and so there were these other lower gods that you could go to for your supplications. The phrase, "there is no God but God," would have elicited a collective yawn from pre-Islamic Arabia. But the condemnation of the economic situation in Arabia, the political situation, that was intolerable to the ruling powers, and that's where the friction between the Prophet Muhammad and the Quraysh, this massive tribe that ruled Mecca, originally came from. That's where the conflict and the clash came from. And by the way, that should sound familiar to people familiar with other prophetic histories, especially the history of Jesus. I mean, really, Jesus' conflict with the authorities of his time had far less to do with theological doctrine than it had with social and economic issues. That's what a prophet does. A prophet is a reformer, not a creator of religion.
When did Muhammad live? Which century?
Well, so the traditions say that he was born in the year 570 AD. That's most certainly not a historical and accurate calendrical date. The fact of the matter is in pre-Islamic Arabia, birthdays were not significant events, so nobody knew when the Prophet Muhammad was born, and nobody cared until he was declared to be a prophet. But we go with 570 as the traditional date, so let's just say near the end of the 6th century. And then he died somewhere sort of in the first third of the 7th century. I think what's really unique about the Prophet Muhammad when it comes to sort of the history, the prophetic history that many people are familiar with, is that we usually hear about our prophets being failures, right? That's kind of the history of prophethood that one expects. A prophet gets a message from God, nobody listens to him, he usually dies in disgrace, and then after he dies, people say, he was right, and we should have listened to him all along. What's unique about the Prophet Muhammad is that while he was disadvantaged and disgraced for the first half of his prophetic experience, the second half was enormously successful. He actually succeeded. He created a little statelet based on his revelations. And interestingly enough, it's that success that I think creates the greatest amount of suspicion among non-Muslims about the Prophet Muhammad. He couldn't have possibly been a prophet of God because he succeeded, because his message took, because people listened and agreed. Whereas we want a prophet that is rejected and tortured and killed. And that's a really interesting phenomenon to me, the way in which the prophet's success is seen as proof of his non-prophet status.
By the time he lived on earth, how established was Christianity?
Very well established. It's a very fascinating thing here. So Christianity, of course, starts in around the mid to the end of the 1st century. It comes, as I say, in multiple forms until around the start of the 4th century, when the Emperor Constantine converts to Christianity and begins the process, he doesn't do it himself, but begins the process of turning Christianity into the official religion of Rome. The problem for Constantine, however, is that there are about 100 different kinds of Christianity, and you can't have Christianity be the imperial religion of the world's most powerful empire unless it comes in one flavor. And so Constantine quite famously takes the leaders of the Christian movement, the bishops of the Christian movement, he locks them up in a room in a small town called Nicaea, and he essentially says, do not come out of this room until you figure out what Christianity is, because it can only be one thing. And of course the bishops at the time come up with what is known as the Nicene Creed, defining more or less what Orthodox Christianity shall be. But what happens immediately after the Nicene Council is that all of these heterodox versions of Christianity overnight become illegal. And anyone who espouses those views has essentially three choices. Either get the heck out of Rome as fast as possible, convert to Orthodox Christianity, or die. What happens is you have this flooding into the lands of the Middle East of these heterodox Christian communities who want to maintain their faith but cannot do so in Rome. So where do they go? They go to the Near East, they go to Iran, they go to North Africa, and they go to the Arabian Peninsula. So 200 years later, by the time the Prophet Muhammad arises, he is living in a world that is full of Christians, but not the kind of Orthodox Christians that you see in Rome. Certainly not the Orthodox Trinitarian versions of Christian. These are Christians who are referred to sometimes as monophysites or Gnostic Christians, Christians who believe that Jesus only had a singular nature, be it only human or only divine, who rejected the notion of the Trinity. And so for the Prophet Muhammad, he would have been very familiar with this one particular version of Christian thought. By the way, just as he would have been extremely familiar with Judaism, because the Jewish tribes in the Arabian Peninsula were also many and quite successful and well established. All of this is to say that the Prophet Muhammad was born and grew up in a world steeped in Jewish and Christian thought, Jewish and Christian mythology. There's a reason why, when you read the Quran, when it sometimes restates the great stories of the Hebrew Scriptures, be it stories about Jacob or Joseph or Moses or Abraham, it often begins those stories with the words recall or remember. Recall when Moses received the commandments. Remember what happened to Joseph when he fled from his brothers. The reason for that is quite simple. The Quran is repeating stories that it assumes its audience is already familiar with, and indeed they would have been familiar with it because these stories were part of the milieu of pre-Islamic Arabia.
How political was Constantine's move to Christianity?
You know, I get asked that question a lot. And I think that most historians, most scholars would say that it was purely a political decision. After all, Constantine was immersed in a civil war over other claimants to the throne of emperor, and that this sort of sudden conversion to Christianity was, whether it was intended to or not, the one element that pushed him over to the top and allowed him to claim the throne for himself. I am one of these historians who tends to think, you know, we should probably just take people at their words. If Constantine says that he had an ecstatic spiritual experience in which Jesus came to him and told him to believe in him, let's just go ahead and take his word for it. Were there political implications or perhaps even political ideas behind this conversion? Certainly so. But who are we to judge a person's soul?
Good afternoon and welcome to Book TV's monthly program called In Depth. This is where we talk to one author about his or her body of work. This past year we've had Mark Levin, Amity Shlaes, Bonnie Morris, Luis Rodriguez as some of our guests on In Depth. And this month we have international bestseller Reza Aslan. Here are his nonfiction books. He began in 2005 with No God But God, The Origins, Evolution, and Future of Islam. Beyond Fundamentalism, Confronting Religious Extremism in the Age of Globalization came out in 2010. And Zealot came out last year, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. Professor Aslan also teaches creative writing at UC Riverside. He got his bachelor's degree at Santa Clara, his master's in divinity at Harvard, a master's of fine arts at the University of Iowa Writers Workshop, and finally a PhD at UC Santa Barbara, and that was a religion PhD, wasn't it?
That's right, that's right. I actually got my degree from the sociology department because my dissertation was about jihadism as a social movement. but I did all of my coursework in the Department of Religion.
Well, that's another topic we wanted to bring up. But first, I want to go to Zealot, which got a lot of attention last year when it came out. And you write in that book that today I can confidently say that 2 decades of rigorous academic research into the origins of Christianity has made me a more genuinely committed disciple of Jesus of Nazareth than I ever was of Jesus Christ.
Yes. As I say in the book, when I was 15 years old, I went to an evangelical youth camp with some friends in Northern California, and there heard the gospel story for the first time. It was a transformative experience for me. This story of the God of heaven and earth coming down in the form of a child, of dying for our sins, this promise that all who believe in him shall also never die but have eternal life. I had never heard anything like this before in my life. I immediately converted to this particularly conservative brand of evangelical Christianity and began preaching this gospel message as I had heard it to everyone, whether they wanted to hear it or not, frankly. But when I went to university and began to study the New Testament for a living, what I discovered was a great distance between the Christ of faith, as I had learned about him in my church, and the Jesus of history, as I was studying him at university. These were different individuals, and I know that that really disturbs a lot of people, both people of faith and people without faith, because we think that they are the same, that the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith are the same person, but they are not the same person. The Christ of faith is derived from the Jesus of history, certainly, but the Jesus of history, this Jewish peasant revolutionary who lived in the backwoods of Galilee 2,000 years ago, became so much more real to me, so much more accessible and appealing, that while I left Christianity as a faith, I became absolutely obsessed with learning everything that I could about this man, and found him to be so much more extraordinary, and indeed, I would say, so much more worth following than the Christ of faith.
Were you raised a Muslim?
I was. I came from a fairly lukewarm Muslim family in Iran. We were culturally Muslim the way so many people around the world are culturally religious. When we moved to the United States in 1979, of course, this was in the height of the Iran hostage crisis, and being a Muslim was not the easiest thing to be in the United States. I and my family really sort of scrubbed our lives of anything that hinted at Islam. For me especially, it was a way of absorbing into American culture. I was a 7-8-year-old boy. I wanted to be normal. I didn't want to stand out in any way. But I'd always been deeply interested in religion, despite the fact that I didn't come from a very religious family or receive any kind of religious or spiritual edification in my household. I think partly it had to do with my experience of revolutionary Iran, those images of the power that religion has to transform a society for good and for bad never left me. And it created this indelible and deep desire to know more about religion and spirituality. As I say, despite the fact that I didn't really have an opportunity to really do so until I was 15 years old and first had an opportunity to express it. But, I've always been interested in religion. I've always been interested in religious history, religious archaeology, religious literature, religious phenomenology, spirituality. These are things that fascinate me to no end.
202 is the area code, 585-3880. If you'd like to participate in our conversation this afternoon with Reza Aslan, and you live in the East and Central time zones, 585-3881. If you live out west, by the way, you can also contact us if the phone lines are busy through social media. Email booktv@cspan.org. You can send us a tweet, @booktv is our Twitter handle. And finally, you can make a comment on our Facebook page, facebook.com/booktv. You're Shia?
I do not accept any kind of sectarian designation at all. Again, I think for me, well, look, let me put it this way. when you study the religions of the world, it becomes very difficult to take any religion all that seriously. Because what you recognize, what you discover very, very early on, is that all these religions are basically saying the exact same thing. They're expressing the same aspirations, the same desires, the same answers, often using the same mythology to do so. That really what you see are different symbols and metaphors expressing the exact same sentiments. Now, most of my colleagues would say, well then why bother choosing one of those? If they're all saying the same thing, let's just ignore it all. And indeed, I think what would surprise a lot of viewers about the study of religion and scholars of religion like myself is that we're all pretty much atheists. But a few of us are not. I am, an exception. I am one of these, scholars of religion who also takes faith very seriously. Most of my colleagues view faith the way that a biologist views a microbe. It's something to be studied from afar, from a distance, but not, something that is absorbed or taken personally by any means. I study the world's religions, and I am a person of faith. And I follow something that the Buddha once said, which is that if you want to draw water, you do not dig 6 1-foot wells. You dig 1 6-foot well. Islam is my 6-foot well. It's the path, the symbols and metaphors that I use to understand my place in the world and to experience the reality of transcendence. But what the Buddha meant is that while your well may be separate, you are drawing the water that every other well around you is drawing from. The water is the same, and that's something that I never forget. My identity as a Muslim comes primarily from my acceptance of Islamic metaphors, Islamic symbols, as a comfortable and viable way of expressing the ineffable, incomprehensible experience of the divine. But that's all it is. It's just a language. It's just symbols and metaphors. Those symbols and metaphors are not more true. They're not more right. They're just more appealing. That's all.
How significant is the Sunni-Shia split, and what's it created?
It's a lot more significant nowadays than I think it has been in the past. Certainly as the main dividing line in Islam. Sunni, by the way, make up about 85% of the world's Muslims. The Shia make around 15%. Very much a historical shift, like the Catholic Protestant shift. It had as much to do with political and social issues, and indeed even economic issues. The Shia tended to be far less economically successful than the Sunni were. The Sunni maintained the power and the structure of the first Islamic empire. But nevertheless, in the same way that many Christians would say, Catholic, Protestant, it's all Christianity, and many Christians would say, no, Catholics are right and Protestants are wrong, it's very much an individual experience. I've seen Muslims who say these sects are irrelevant, and I've seen Muslims who say that, no, if you're a Shia, you are an apostate, you are an unbeliever. But ultimately, the reason that these sectarian differences have risen to the forefront over the last decade, and it really has been just the last decade or so. Well, you know what, let's say around 2001, around the time of the invasion of Afghanistan, is because there has been this deep political divide in the Middle East. There has been, in other words, political benefit from inside and outside forces to stoke sectarian tensions for one's own nationalistic concerns. You see this, of course, a lot with the Cold War between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Iran, which sees itself as the banner of Shia Islam, and Saudi Arabia, which sees itself as the banner of Sunni Islam. These two nations have been fighting a Cold War in the region for far more than a decade. and have deliberately stoked sectarian tensions for their own benefit. Now, in many cases, those sectarian tensions have become no longer controllable for either country. But in Bahrain, in Lebanon, in Syria, well, even the United States has stoked sectarian tension in that region. You know, there is this idea that you can control religious extremism, that you can use it to your advantage. And, you know, I'm hoping one day we're going to learn that that's just simply not the case, that you can't control fanatics, no matter how hard you try.
In your book, Beyond Fundamentalism, by the way, what was the original title of that book and why did it change?
The original title was How to Win a Cosmic War. And why did it change? These are one of these mysteries of the publishing world that authors are never privy to. It was a publisher's decision to change the title.
Well, in the current version of Beyond Fundamentalism, Confronting Religious Extremism in the Age of Globalization, you write that a cosmic war is a religious war. It is a conflict in which God is believed to be directly engaged on one side over the other. It partitions the world into black and white, good and evil, us and them. In such a war, there is no middle ground. Everyone must choose a side. It is a simple equation. If you are not us, you must be them. You are the enemy and must be destroyed.
That's right. And in fact, this notion of cosmic war is something that exists in all great religious traditions. In the West, of course, it can be traced right to the Torah. This is precisely the kind of war that God demands of the Israelites, a war in which the Israelites themselves are not even really participants in. The Israelites are essentially nothing more than the pawns whereby God destroys his enemies himself. When you look at the great wars of the Hebrew Bible, whether it was the conquest of Canaan or the destruction of the Jebusites or the destruction of the Amalekites or any of these tribes that the Israelites destroyed, the Bible makes it very clear. These enemies did not fall to Israel. Israel's arms, Israel's weapons, Israel's might was irrelevant. It was God who destroyed these armies. And indeed, it wasn't so much that God, the God of the Jews, the God of the Israelites, destroyed these different tribes. It's that God destroyed the gods of these other tribes. The very concept of divine war in the ancient mind had less to do with armies fighting each other than it did with gods fighting each other. When the Israelites destroyed the Canaanites, what was actually happening was that the God of Israel, Yahweh, was destroying the God of Canaan, Baal. That's how it worked. And to take it to the next level, when the Babylonians destroyed the Israelites, it wasn't two armies fighting each other, it was the God of Babylon, Marduk, destroying the God of the Israelites, Yahweh. And indeed, the very notion of monotheism, the way that we understand it, the notion that there is just one God and no other, is a fairly late notion in the Bible. It doesn't really show up until after the Babylonian captivity in 586 BC. Abraham was not a monotheist. Abraham was a henotheist. He believed that his God was the highest God, but that there were other gods. Moses was not a monotheist. He was a henotheist. He believed that his God was the highest God. And by the way, Moses' God was not Abraham's God. Abraham's God was called El, or El Shaddai, and Moses' God was called Yahweh. El was a Canaanite god, a Canaanite deity. Yahweh was an Egyptian deity. It's only after the Babylonian captivity that El and Yahweh become a single God. El Yahweh, as scholars sometimes refer to him, and the concept of monotheism is born. All of this is to say, that notion of divine war, that we human beings are merely pawns in a cosmic conflict between the forces of good and evil, between angels and demons, that this battle is not really taking place on earth, it's taking place in the heavens, that it's an eternal battle one in which the forces of good will eventually defeat the forces of evil. This is a phenomenon that you find playing itself out right now in a large part of the conflicts around the world, not least of all in the Middle East. It's the conflict that Al-Qaeda is fighting. It's the conflict that ISIS is fighting. It's a conflict that a great many Jewish extremists in Israel are fighting. It's a conflict that many people in the US military themselves think that they are fighting. A war between the forces of good and evil, not between the armies on earth. That's a cosmic war, and the great fear about cosmic wars, as I say in the book, is that they are unwinnable.
Paul emails in from Los Gatos, California. How can Islam ever be at peace with the Western democracies when one goal of Islam is for all the world to be ruled by Islamic law? The Quran says, quote, and fight with them until there is no persecution, and religion should be only for Allah.
Well, first of all, that is not a goal of Islam, this notion of, that the whole world has to be under Islam. And that verse in the Quran is, of course, a historically contextual verse. I mean, what's important to understand is for the latter half of the Prophet's life, he was at war with the pagan tribes of Arabia. Secondly, it's also important to understand that as a proselytizing faith, that Muslims, of course, believe that their message should be viewed by all people. All proselytizing faiths believe this. But the notion that Islam is a religion that is spread by the sword is actually historically incorrect. Indeed, for the first 150, 200 years of Islam, not only was conversion not mandatory or forced upon people, it was discouraged because there were financial benefits of conversion that created a situation whereby the first Islamic empire, the Umayyad Empire, which ruled until about 750 AD, actually made it very difficult for people to convert to Islam because you had to pay fewer taxes if you were a Muslim, and so they didn't want people to pay these taxes. That said, I do think it's important to understand that this notion of a conflict between Islam and Western democracies is a figment of the imagination. 1/3 of the world's Muslims live in democratic state. The largest, most populous Muslim country in the world, Indonesia, is a democracy. The second most populous Muslim country in the world, Pakistan, is a democracy. Turkey is a democracy. Bangladesh is a democracy. Senegal is a democracy. Malaysia is a democracy. Indeed, of the 10 most populous countries in the world, populous Muslim countries in the world, 5, technically 7, but 2 of them are not very good democracies. Certainly Egypt cannot be called a democracy any longer, are democracies. So this notion that Islam is somehow inherently anti-democratic is simply factually, historically, empirically inaccurate. But one could make the argument that all religions, because they rely on a notion of absolutism, are anti-democratic. I mean, let's be honest, we live in a country in the United States in which, again, according to Pew, about 1/3 of Americans, 100 million of us, fall under the designate of religious nationalists. Dominionists is the term that scholars use. These are Christians who believe that the United States is a Christian nation founded exclusively on Christian values and Christian principles and should be, as Rick Santorum has repeatedly said, as Mike Huckabee said on the campaign trail when he was running for president, should be predicated exclusively on biblical values. And indeed, to paraphrase Mike Huckabee, that the very constitution of this country needs to be changed so that it aligns with biblical values. Now, one can quite easily say that that is an anti-democratic view because it is essentially prioritizing religion and one version of religion, one interpretation of religion over all others and over civil society. So, in a sense, all religions are both anti-democratic and democratic. which goes back to what I've been saying for the last hour, which is that religion is nothing more than interpretation. Religion is what a religious person says it is. Islam is what any Muslim says it is. My version of Islam is as valid as Osama bin Laden's version of Islam. I would love to sit here and say that his version of Islam is incorrect and my version is right, except that that's not true. We're both right and we're both wrong. You have the Christian abortion bomber. His version of Christianity is as correct as Desmond Tutu's version of Christianity. They are both right, and they are both wrong. So, if you have Muslims who say democracy is antithetical to Islam, they're right. If you have Muslims who say democracy is absolutely compatible with Islam, they're right. So, stop saying Islam is this or that, Christianity is this or that. There is no such thing as this or that when it comes to religion. It's all what an individual says it is.
Reza Aslan, in Zealot, this is the dedication for my wife, Jessica Jackley, and the entire Jackley clan, whose love and acceptance have taught me more about Jesus than all my years of research and study.
Well, anybody who saw that famously uncomfortable Fox News interview knows that my wife is a Christian, as is my mother. By the way, I'm the one who converted my mother to Christianity, and she's still a very devout Christian. And my wife and I have twin boys that we always joke are undeclared, but who will grow up in all great religious traditions and will decide for themselves what they want to believe. The reason I made that dedication is because my wife's family comes from a very devout evangelical Christian background. And for a lot of people, that seems incongruous. How could it be that, this devout, conservative, evangelical family, my brother-in-law is an evangelical pastor, can have in their family a Muslim of all people? And while they will freely admit that when they discovered that their daughter was, dating and about to marry a Muslim man, they were confused. They'd never met a Muslim before. My mother-in-law, humorously says the only thing she knew about Islam is what Sean Hannity told her. And yet, within 5 minutes of meeting me, all of that went away. And what they displayed towards me is a love and acceptance and compassion that is the best expression of Christianity. Not the expression of Christianity that we so often see in the media, that we see from our politicians, a religion of exclusion, a religion that is all about who is not part of us, who does not receive salvation, but the Christianity that is about inclusion, that is about love, that is about acceptance. And they really taught me what true Christianity is about. And I am forever grateful for it. I am as much a part of their family as anyone else. We have an amazing relationship, and I have learned as much from them as they've learned from me.
We have 2 hours left in our program today on Book TV. Reza Aslan is our guest, and now it's your turn to talk to him. Michael, Fayette, Alabama, you're first up. Hi.
Oh, thanks tremendously. Dr. Aslan, before my question, I want to apologize sincerely on behalf of all of us Christians for what you and other Islamics have heard too often in the United States. Allah is a false god. You worship it. Weans worship, and our Jewish sisters and brothers worship the only real God. I can't stand that coming out of local teaching. What is it called? Talk radio down here. Let's be honest, it's Protestant radio. Sadly, we don't get the splendid Eternal Word television network Catholic, even though that's just 80 miles away in Alabama.
Michael, could you give us your religious background, and are you a person of faith today?
But don't anybody call me, please don't anybody call me a conservative. I'm conservative on moral and ethical values, especially big Hollywood, big Nashville, big Marvel and DC Comics, big Madison Avenue, and I'm even angry about R-rated, dumb R-rated comedies being in the, what is it called, reach of children under 12 thanks to Netflix and video stores. But we are very much politically liberal when it comes to government being involved in foreign humanitarian aid, in domestic social spending, and creating jobs. I mean, they wanted work.
Michael, we're going to leave it there, and we'll see if Reza Aslan has any comment for you.
Well, I think that that's a perfect expression of what I've been saying all along about religion being a matter of identity, not necessarily just a matter of faith and practice. That you could be an extreme liberal evangelical Christian, like my friend Jim Wallace is, a creator of Sojourners, or you can be an extreme conservative evangelical Christian. In other words, you may have the same beliefs and practices, but those beliefs and practices can be expressed in diametrically opposite ways. The other thing that I'll just say, Michael, and I appreciate what you were saying, and listen, I've gotten as much love from Christians as I've gotten anger and hate. And again, it goes back to individuals and the way individuals think for themselves. The problem for me, I've been saying earlier that we should not confuse religion with faith, that they are different things. Religion is not faith. Faith is mysterious, it's ineffable, it's deeply individualistic. If you believe in God, you believe in something that is by definition impossible for the human mind to comprehend. God is, if anything, utterly transcendent. We do not have the ability to understand what God is, to let alone express what God is. What is religion? The language that helps us express it. That's it. It's just a language of symbols and metaphors that give us the opportunity to express to ourselves and to like-minded people the ineffable experience of faith. The danger comes when people confuse religion with faith, when they think that religion is the destination, not the path to a destination, when they think that religion is the ends, not the means to an end. And I think that if we did a better job, people of faith, of all faiths, in recognizing that my particular religion is just a unique way of expressing similar sentiments as other people of religion, we would have far greater peace, far greater understanding than we do now. Unfortunately, most religious people, be they Jewish or Muslim or Christian or Buddhist or Hindu or whatever, most religious people tend to believe in their religion, not in what their religion tells them to believe. In other words, your faith is not in God, but in your religion. And that, I think, is a tragic, tragic mistake.
Professor Aslan, are your books available in your home country of Iran? Are they available in Israel or some of the more volatile Arab countries?
My books, especially No God But God, have been translated into Hebrew and are quite popular in Israel. And in Arabic, there's an Urdu version of coming. Zealot, it will be available in Arabic and Urdu in the next year. It takes a while to do the translation. We, of course, have very strict sanction laws against Iran. The Treasury Department makes it very difficult to translate and sell English material in Farsi to an Iranian audience. And, of course, Iran makes it very difficult for material like this to be spread out. So what I have done is I have paid for my own Persian translations of my books, and if you are not in Iran, you can go to Amazon and buy them in Persian. But if you are in Iran, you can just simply go to my website, rezaaslan.com, and download a free version in Farsi of my books. No God But God is available right now. The Persian translation of Zealot is finished, and we're in the process of putting it online so that any Farsi speaker anywhere in the world can have free access to it.
Because of your writing, have there been any fatwas against you? Be them Muslim, Christian, or Jewish?
Sure. But listen, as I like to say, fatwas are a dime a dozen. If I can get you give me an hour, I'll get you a fatwa on any subject that you want. A fatwa, which is, achieved almost sort of supernatural dimensions in the United States because, of course, the violence that are taking place and perhaps the Salman Rushdie affair. A fatwa is nothing more than a juristic opinion by a mufti. A mufti is just any legal scholar who has achieved a certain number of years of training in Islamic law. There is no enforcement mechanism for a fatwa. It's literally an opinion. It's not a papal bull. There is no sort of infallibility to it. And indeed, what's really fascinating about fatwas is that no fatwa can overcome another fatwa. So in other words, if you have two imams in this room and one issues a fatwa saying Coke is evil, drink Pepsi, and the other issues a fatwa saying Pepsi is evil, drink Coke, there is no mechanism to decide which is correct. You as a Muslim get to just simply decide. If you like this imam, you follow his fatwas. If you don't, you follow the other guy's fatwas. And indeed, most Muslims don't have a single imam that they follow. They just follow whatever fatwas they like. So they'll follow Imam A when it comes to, say, fatwas about marriage or purity. They'll follow Imam B when it comes to fatwas about, say, living in a certain way or let's say foreign issues. That's the thing about Islam, is that, in a sense, ironically speaking, because of the previous caller, it is a quintessentially democratic religion in that it's really up to you who you want to follow.
John is calling in from Issaquah, Washington. John, you're on Book TV.
Yes, my question is that do you see the future of religions continuing to diversify and grow in number, or do you see a future where religions coalesce and maybe become like one unified religion?
What a fantastic question. And this is something that I'm deeply interested in when I write about religious traditions, because I do believe that you can sort of move forward in the timeline, the history of religions, and make certain predictions. And I think that this is going to sound weird, but both of your sort of two possibilities of religion are becoming true. One, religion is becoming far more individualistic. It's becoming fractured into greater sects and schisms. Primarily, this has to do with the internet. I mean, sociologists refer to this process that's taking place over the last decade as post-materialism. That's just a fancy way of saying that the very definition of community is altering right before our eyes. Think about it this way. For all of human history, I mean, ever since we were, Neanderthals living in caves, for all of human history, the definition of community was the people around you. The people in your cave, the people in your tribe, the people in your village, the people in your city, the people in your country, the people in your nation. It's geographically defined what it means to be in a community. In the last decade, that definition has been shattered by the internet, because now community is no longer geographically constrained. Indeed, a kid in Indonesia, let's say a Christian kid in Indonesia, may have more in common with a Muslim kid in Los Angeles because they share the same love of music, love of movies, they share the same interests, they share the same values, than either of those kids may have in common with their own sort of geographically defined communities. This is what we mean by post-materialism. In other words, it's no longer safety or sustenance or shelter that defines a community. It's these post-materialist values. And religion has been utterly shattered. The very definition has been utterly shattered by these new community formations, which is why we're seeing more sort of religious sects popping up online. People don't meet in actual churches, they meet in chat rooms. So that's one future of religion. The other future of religion, however, is one in which science and religion are starting to become closer and closer to each other. Now, this drives both religious and scientific people mad when I say this, but the truth of the matter is that the more science begins to redefine the nature of reality, the more it starts to use religious language to do so, certainly mystical language to do so. The idea that all matter is eternal, that it has always existed and will always exist, that what makes me what I am is the same thing that makes this table what it is. These are mystical religious ideas that have been around for thousands of years. So I think that if we look at these two trends and move into the future, we can start making some very interesting predictions about what religion will look like 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now. What I can tell you with some confidence is that religion is not going to go away. We've been talking about the death of God for about 100 years now. At the dawn of the 20th century, 1/2 of the world's population defined itself as either Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, or Buddhist. 100 years of secularism, of scientific advancement, of economic development, and that number is now 2/3. It seems that people are becoming more religious, not less religious. And I don't think that there's a reason why this trend is going to reverse anytime soon.
Mary, Atlanta, good afternoon. Please go ahead.
Hey, Reza. I just have to say I admire any person who can put a sentence together that has fatwa and papal bull at the same time.
I appreciate that.
Brilliant. Are you familiar with Richard Rohr and his Center for Action and Contemplation?
I've heard of it. Yes, I have.
Okay. The reason I ask is he's the type of Catholic. He's a Franciscan monk, and his outreach. I'm Palestinian. I'm Episcopalian, so I'm not a Catholic. But he preaches the way that the new Pope, does. It's very inclusive, and basically where I want to get is not an ad for him. I'm sorry, but to come up with everything that religion comes down to. I liked where you went with symbols and metaphors.
Yeah.
But I'm looking for the actionable consequences of those metaphors, and I'm not looking for war. I'm Palestinian, need no more of that. I'm looking for, just take Jesus as one. Healing, preaching, feeding, basically taking care of our regular sisters and brothers of all different colors and faiths. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I love where your brain is. It is astounding. Is there an actionable quote?
Yeah.
All right, Mary, thank you very much.
Very good question, Mary. Thank you. Before I begin and answer that question, let me just talk a little bit about my love for Pope Francis. Everybody loves Pope Francis for a whole host of reasons, but people what they don't realize is that Pope Francis is the very first Jesuit pope. Which, if you understand anything about Catholic history and anything about the Jesuits, you understand what a remarkable statement that is, how earth-shattering it is to have a Jesuit pope finally at the Vatican, and as a proud product of a Jesuit education. In fact, it was the Jesuits who first taught me about religion. It was the Jesuits who first taught me about the historical Jesus. I couldn't be prouder or happier to have Pope Francis in the papacy right now, because at the heart of the Jesuit ideal is the preferential option for the poor, is the notion that Jesus' message is about the poor and for the poor, and that the only way to really live up to Jesus' commandment is to also have a commitment to the poor, to the dispossessed, to the marginalized. And Pope Francis, I think, has learned a valuable lesson from his predecessor, Pope Benedict, which is that, the Catholic Church is two things. It's a bureaucracy and a church. And You can't really reform the bureaucracy. Pope Benedict realized this. But you can reform the church. And the way to do so is to just simply live out the commandments of Jesus and hope everyone else follows. And that's what Pope Francis has done. And I am so, so proud to be a product of a Jesuit education and someone who really supports this Pope and what he's been doing. So that's my 2 cents on the Pope. This notion of the sort of the things that religions have in common is, of course, incredibly important. At the heart of it is this idea that is found in all religious traditions, and which is most familiar to Jews and Christians as do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The golden rule exists in every religious traditions in the world. Religions that go far back before Judaism. The Code of Hammurabi, the oldest, most ancient code of ethics that we have, has the golden rule in it. This idea that there is a way of treating other people, regardless of their race or ethnicity, of their religion, their nationality, and it's simply how you yourself want to be treated, seems so basic. But at the heart of it is this notion of compassion, that we are to have compassion for one another, that we are not to focus on our differences, but the things that we have in common. Now, I will be the first to admit that this is very difficult to do. It's difficult for the reasons that I mentioned before, because people confuse religion for faith, and so they focus on their religion that divides us rather than the faith that unites us, but also because we tend to focus on something that I call interfaith dialogue. That if we can all come together, if a Jew and a Christian and a Muslim can come together and talk to one another about their religions, that it'll create a greater bond. It's a beautiful idea, and I'm not by any means dismissing it. It's a great thing and it should happen, but it's not enough. Interfaith dialogue is not the end-all and be-all. And so the advice that I have for all those great churches and synagogues and mosques who want to have greater connection, greater connectivity and cooperation with people of other faith, it's not enough to come together to talk about the things that unite you. What you need is interfaith action. I am a great supporter of a wonderful American organization called Interfaith Youth Corps, founded by my friend Ibu Patel out of Chicago. The Interfaith Youth Corps has a very simple message. Rather than getting young people of different religions to sit into a room and talk about the things that unite and divide them, instead they go out onto the streets and they clean the streets. They help build hospitals. They feed the poor and the needy. They clothe those who are naked. In other words, they put their shared values into action. Because the one thing that we all have in common, regardless of what religion we are, is that we all have the same ideals. We have the same morals. We have the same values. At the foundation of all these religions is care for those who cannot care for themselves. So, you want greater connection, greater peace, greater pluralism between religious traditions? Stop talking about the things that you have in common and go put those things in action.
David, Rochester, New York. Please go ahead with your question or comment for Reza Aslan.
Yes, Dr. Aslan, you mentioned earlier in this program, it's been so long, I forgot the question. Zoroastrianism, thank you. And I believe that was the religion of Persia before it became Iran. And what I was wondering is, are there any vestiges left of this religion in present-day Iran or any place else, or is it a completely dead religion? Thank you.
What a fantastic question. And I love it when people ask me about Zoroastrianism, because it is one of my favorite religions, and probably, I would say, the most important religion in the history of religions, and I am not saying that lightly. The prophet Zarathustra lived probably around 1100 BC. That's our best guess. Zoroastrianism was the first monotheistic religion. Now, Zarathustra was not the first monotheist. The first monotheist was actually the great Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten, who believed that the Aten was the only God, that all other gods were false gods. That religion did not last very long, but Zarathustra was the first, what we refer to as the revealed prophets. In other words, an individual who claimed to be receiving a direct message from God. Zarathustra was the first one, not Abraham, not Moses. Zarathustra was. Now, what's fascinating about this message is that it begins with this statement that there is only one God. Not henotheism, not that there is a high God and that there are other gods that are lower than God, which is what the sort of prevailing sentiment was in Mesopotamia and the Near East, but that there is just one God, a God that Zarathustra referred to as Ahura Mazda, the Lord Mazda is what he called his God. That all the other so-called gods were not gods. In fact, he designated them as something that had never been said before. He said that they were what he referred to in our modern parlance as angels and demons. That's right. Zarathustra invented the very concept of angels and demons. But that wasn't the only thing that Zarathustra invented. Zarathustra invented the concept of heaven and hell. Before this time, really, there was a notion of the afterlife, but the afterlife was just a mirror of the life in present. If you were a warrior in this life, you died and you were a warrior in the afterlife. If you were a slave in this life, you died and you were a slave in the afterlife. Zarathustra was the first prophet to argue that what your role was in the afterlife had nothing to do with your position in this life, but it had to do with your moral choices. Zarathustra started this phrase called good thoughts, good words, good deeds. If you accumulated enough good thoughts, good words, good deeds in this life, well, then you went to a good afterlife, heaven. If you did not, you went to a bad afterlife, hell. Zarathustra had such a deep impact on what we now know as religion because the first great Iranian empire, the Achaemenid Empire of Cyrus the Great, was a Zoroastrian empire. And those who remember your ancient history, it was Cyrus the Great that liberated the Jews from Babylonian captivity, sent them back to Israel to rebuild their temple. And indeed, the Jews thank Cyrus the Great in the Hebrew Bible by naming him Messiah. Judaism was deeply influenced by Zoroastrian ideology. And indeed, what we know as Christianity can in many ways be understood as a marriage of Zoroastrianism and Judaism. Zoroastrianism to this day is not a dead religion, but it is a dying religion. There are, I would say, maybe 250,000 Zoroastrians left in the world. It's a dying religion because it's a religion that you can't convert to, and any religion that you can't convert to eventually dies out. It's a shame because it is an important and historic religious tradition.
Bev Corwin tweets into you, Reza Aslan, why do religions seem to consistently degrade and persecute women?
Because they are patriarchal institutions. Religions are man-made, literally. All religions are man-made. And so when it comes time to interpret a religion, it's going to be interpreted in ways that benefit men. And again, this is true of all religious traditions.
And in fact, you write in No God But God, The Origins, Evolution, and Future of Islam, you write, the fact is that for 14 centuries, the science of Quranic commentary has been the exclusive domain of Muslim men. And because each one of the exegetes inevitably brings to the Quran his own ideology and his own preconceived notions, it should not be surprising to learn that certain verses have most often been read in their most misogynist interpretation.
And again, I would say that's true of all religions.
Debbie, Albuquerque, good afternoon to you.
Hi, how you doing? I've been waiting to talk to you. I find what you're talking about absolutely fascinating. I do take exception. You're a sociology major and theology. Then why did you gloss over about talking about jihadists? Because I heard that you neglected to mention that one of the very first attacks was on Mecca. November 20th, 1979, when they took Mecca for 2 weeks. You didn't mention that at all. And that was really the very first strike that they took against the United States, was like we became the infidels from that point on. I mean, yeah, we were focused with them taking the hostages in Tehran, and it sort of got glossed over and didn't make the news. But you didn't mention anything about that, and I'm just curious why, because I'm also a sociology major, and I know about it, so I'm just sort of curious why you made reference to that, in the last decade this has been an uprising, when that's truly incorrect if you actually do know history. It started in 79 in Mecca. And I'll take my response off the air. Thank you.
And if you would, in that, Professor Aslan, also include, where did jihadism come from?
Sure. Well, first of all, what I said was the sectarian conflict between Sunni and Shia has been exacerbated over the last decade, not jihadism. Jihadism is a very specific and very new phenomenon. Jared Bachman at West Point says that it's probably can be traced to about 2000. I would go a little bit further. I would say that it can probably be traced to about 1989 and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Jihadism is a transnational movement. In other words, it's a movement of radical Muslims who believe that the very concept of the nation state is anathema to Islam. They want to reconstitute the world as a single caliphate under their control. The reason I go through this important terminology is that we tend to conflate jihadist and Islamist as though they're the same thing, when in reality they are opposite things. Islamism is a nationalistic ideology. It is a political philosophy predicated on the creation of an Islamic state. Islamists are not globalists, in other words. They have a distinctly, geographically, nationalistically defined objective. Jihadists do not. Jihadists want to get rid of all borders, all boundaries, and to reconstitute the world under their command. Al-Qaeda is a jihadist organization. ISIS is a jihadist organization. The Muslim Brotherhood is an Islamist organization. Hamas is an Islamist organization. It's very important that we get these terms right, because they require vastly different responses. An Islamist organization, a nationalist organization, wants something concrete, wants something measurable. And so therefore, whether they can have what they want or not, there's still room for negotiation, room for discussion. A jihadist organization is fighting a cosmic war, as I said earlier. They want nothing. Al-Qaeda cannot be negotiated with. ISIS cannot be negotiated with, because what they want is impossible to achieve in this world. And so they require a completely different response. Now, I would say that fortunately this administration has been much better at understanding the difference between the two organizations, but the media has not. The media conflates these words all the time. I was watching Meet the Press this morning, and ISIS was repeatedly referred to as an Islamist organization. That is factually incorrect. And so terms matter when what is at stake is our national security.
From No God But God, the biggest obstacles in the path to creating a genuine Islamic democracy are not only the traditionalist ulama or jihadist terrorists, but perhaps more destructively, those in the West who stubbornly refuse to recognize that democracy, if it is to be viable and enduring, can never be imported.
That's right. The lesson of the war on terror, I would say.
Got an email here from somebody named Sandra and David Jackley. Reza's in-laws, yes, we are watching. We are his biggest fans. Just wanted to let everyone know that we are honored and blessed to have Reza as our family. He is an amazing man in all ways, and we dearly love him. Reza, we are so touched by your comments and very proud to call you ours. End of commercial for Reza Aslan. Back to your calls.
I love you guys.
Jim in Mercer Island, Washington. Jim, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. Kudos to C-SPAN and Book TV for this wonderful program. This is what makes America great, to have people like this on. Reza, I went to your Seattle Public Library appearance, and it was so overwhelming. I think you were probably overwhelmed, too. I wanted to ask you a question then, but now I get this great opportunity to ask you now. I have a historical question about Jesus and the Christian movement, and I'll ask you, and then I'll hang up and hear it off the air. Okay, here's the question. It's two-part. Of all the Messiah wannabes that came before and after Jesus, why did Jesus stick as a Messiah while the others did not?
Very good question, yeah.
Part number one. And the second part is, why did the Gentiles find this Jesus movement and the new religion so appealing? The Jews didn't, but the Gentiles did. Why? And I'll hang up and listen off the air. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Excellent questions. Yes, you're right. As I write in the book Zealot, there were many messiahs who came before and after Jesus. Many of them far more popular, far more successful in their lifetimes than Jesus was. But of course, 2,000 years later, all of those messiahs have been forgotten about, and only one person is still called Messiah, and that's Jesus of Nazareth. Why is that? Well, partly it had to do with Jesus himself. He was an extraordinary individual, and his social teachings were, I think, what really separated him from his fellow messiahs. This teaching about the kingdom of God, a new world order in which those on the top and those on the bottom would change places, in which the poor and the rich would exchange places, in which the first shall be last, the last shall be first. This was extraordinary. People did not talk like this in first century Palestine. And what we absolutely know about the early Jesus movement is that after Jesus' death, it wasn't so much the things that Jesus did, but the things that Jesus said that were passed from community to community, from follower to follower. His teachings survived his death, in other words. But to put it in its simplest way, the reason why Jesus is still called Messiah, whereas those others were not, it has less to do with anything Jesus himself said or did than it does with what his followers said about him. In light of the resurrection experience, however you want to define that, the disciples had to deal with a fundamental problem, which is that according to everything Judaism has ever said about the role and function of the Messiah, Jesus was not the Messiah. He didn't do anything that the Messiah was supposed to do. He didn't recreate the kingdom of David. He didn't liberate the Jews from foreign occupation. And so, confronted with this fact that by the definition of Messiah, Jesus wasn't the Messiah, the disciples simply changed the definition. They made the Messiah something else, something spiritual, something celestial, someone who performs his functions not in this world but in the next world, someone whose kingdom is not an earthly kingdom but a heavenly kingdom. Now, as you can imagine, for a great many Jews who were familiar with messianic expectations, this didn't work for them. They just simply didn't accept this new definition of Messiah. But the more sort of this definition spread into the Roman Empire, into the diaspora, the more non-Jews found it appealing. Certainly the notion of Jesus as the Son of God, which would have been unusual to Jews, was not that unusual to Gentiles. After all, Caesar was the Son of God. It's not that weird of a notion. And so very, very soon after Jesus' death, within 2 or 3 generations, the non-Jewish converts far outnumbered the Jewish ones, and Christianity began to divorce itself from its Jewish parent and become something new, something wholly independent as it is today.
Reza Aslan, you probably rocked some worlds, some Christian worlds with Zealot, Jesus Not Born in Bethlehem, a new interpretation of Pontius Pilate and his role. But you do write this in your book, and you say, perhaps the most obvious reason not to dismiss the disciples' resurrection experiences out of hand is that, among all the other failed messiahs who came before and after him, Jesus alone is still called the Messiah. Yeah. It was precisely the fervor with which the followers of Jesus believed in his resurrection that transformed this tiny Jewish sect into the largest religion in the world.
And it's interesting because while the resurrection itself is an ahistorical phenomenon, in other words, it's something that historians have no business talking about one way or another, the claim to the resurrection claim by the disciples, is a historical phenomenon. It's an unquestionable historical phenomenon. It's just simply a fact that very soon after Jesus' death, his disciples believed and preached that he was risen again. Now, was he risen again? That's a faith statement. I personally, as someone who believes in God, is obviously open to some pretty absurd possibilities, so I'm not going to deny that Jesus was raised from the dead. I'm just going to say it's not my business as a historian. But what cannot be denied is that whatever happened, this ecstatic experience by the disciples is what, more than anything else, transformed this small Jewish movement into the world's largest religion. And that alone is reason enough to take it seriously.
However you write, there is this nagging fact to consider. One after another of those who claim to have witnessed the risen Jesus went to their own gruesome deaths, refusing to recant their testimony.
Yes, and that in and of itself is not that unusual. Many Jews went to their death for their Jewish beliefs and for what they preached. But again, it is important to understand that this wasn't an idle statement. Belief in Jesus risen from the dead wasn't a joke to these followers. It was something that they were willing to die for. And again, let's not be so quick to just simply dismiss that experience, whatever it was.
An hour and a half left with our guest, Reza Aslan, author of Zealot, No God But God, and Beyond Fundamentalism, professor of creative writing at the University of California, Riverside. Tanya Davis is the producer of this program, and one of the things she likes to do is ask our guests, what are their influences? What are they reading? Some of their favorite books. Here's a look at Professor Aslan's list.
Book TV covers hundreds of author programs throughout the country all year long. Here's a look at some of the events we'll be attending this week. Look for these programs to air in the near future on Book TV on C-SPAN 2. On Tuesday, we're at the Racquet Club of Philadelphia for investigative reporter John Schiffman's account of a sting operation codenamed Operation Shakespeare to stop America's enemies from possession of American-made defense technology. Then on Wednesday at the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California, photographer Doug Menuet presents his documentation of Silicon Valley's tech innovators from 1985 to 2000. On Thursday at Changing Hands Bookstore in Tempe, Arizona, historian and political strategist Chris DeRose looks at the Civil War through the eyes of 5 former presidents: John Tyler, Martin Van Buren, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan. That same night, we're at the Last Bookstore in Los Angeles for religious studies professor Charles Marsh's recounting of the life of German theologian, pastor, and Nazi dissident Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And Friday, it's Freedom Fest, the annual libertarian conference held at Planet Hollywood Resort and Casino in Las Vegas, where Book TV will be taping several author events. That's a look at some of the author programs Book TV will be covering this upcoming week. For more, go to our website, booktv.org, and visit upcoming programs.
C-SPAN 2 providing live coverage of the U.S. Senate floor proceedings and key public policy events. And every weekend, Book TV, now for 15 years, the only television network devoted to nonfiction books and authors. C-SPAN 2, created by the cable TV industry and brought to you as a public service by your local cable or satellite provider. Watch us in HD, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter.
Here's a look at some books that are being published this week. Pat Buchanan, senior advisor to President Richard Nixon, reports on how Nixon resurrected his political career following defeats in the early 1960s to become the 37th President of the United States in The Greatest Comeback. In Neil Armstrong, A Life of Flight, NBC News space correspondent Jay Barbary delves into the personal side of the late astronaut's NASA career, his first step on the moon, and what Armstrong felt the future of space exploration should have been. Katie Pavlich, news editor for townhall.com and Fox News contributor, argues that the Democratic Party has waged a war on women in Assault and Flattery. In Operation Shakespeare, the true story of an elite international sting, Reuters reporter and Pulitzer Prize finalist John Schiffman investigates the sting by a Homeland Security unit to protect U.S. citizens from enemies in possession of American-made weapons and technology. History professor Francois Furstenberg looks at America at the end of the 18th century through the eyes of 5 French refugees in When the United States Spoke French. Look for these titles in bookstores this coming week and watch for the authors in the near future on Book TV and on booktv.org.
Reza Aslan, Salman Rushdie, one of your favorite books and authors.
That's right. And in fact, I remember very clearly the first time that I read Satanic Verses. I must have been 20, I think. I'd heard about it, obviously, and just never really got around to reading it. And I saw it on a friend's bookshelf, and I thought, what's the big deal? Let's read this thing. And it was incredible. The idea that you could write about these deep spiritual ideas in a work of fiction, to make it come alive in the narrative that he did, it really influenced me as a writer. It probably, along with Garcia Marquez and Dostoevsky, are the 3 sort of authors that I thought, this is what I want to do, this is who I want to be.
And who is Charles Eisenstein's Sacred Economics, which you're currently reading? Yeah,
it's a book by not a very well-known political philosopher who teaches at Iowa. It's a book about the way that we can start thinking about money as a sacred thing, the way that it used to be. He makes a very important argument, which is the creation of what we call money arose to facilitate gift exchange. In other words, the idea was that before money, if I had something that was valuable and that you needed, I would give it to you, and then you would give me something that was valuable that I needed. But as this transaction became more complicated, little trinkets arose so that I would say, well, thank you for the chicken. I don't have anything of value to give you now, but here's this trinket, and later on you can give me this trinket and I will give you something valuable. And what has obviously happened in the modern world is that this trinket has all of a sudden become intrinsically valuable. In other words, it's not about what this trinket gets me, but the trinket itself. And that, more than anything, has led to the uncontrolled greed, the tremendous wealth gap that we see around the world. And what Eisenstein is trying to do is trying to create a sense, an understanding of money that returns to its original notion as a sacred thing that is nothing more than an exchange between individuals for goods and services.
Now, if you'd like to participate in our conversation with Reza Aslan, and the phone lines are jammed, You can also contact us via social media. Our email address is booktv@cspan.org. You can leave a comment on Twitter. @BookTV is our handle there. And finally, you can make a comment on our Facebook page, facebook.com/booktv. Alexander, Ocala, Florida, you're on the air.
Gentlemen, first and foremost, thank you so much for having me on the program. I just have one quick question. I am constantly, on a consistent basis, hearing these self-proclaimed prophets and television ministers constantly say that we should not listen to the educated academia scholars who are concerned with theology, that this is nothing but false and there's a whole premise behind that. What are your thoughts about that? And I will take this off air. Thank you so much again, gentlemen. Thank you.
Well, they may have a point. We do tend to bloviate a lot. Listen, this suspicion about academia and scholarship, which is widespread, by the way, is really our fault. I mean, it's the fault of academics and scholars. We spend so much of our time talking amongst ourselves, pontificating in our dusty office libraries, and so little time trying to communicate our ideas to a popular general audience that it's no wonder that we are seen with suspicion, particularly by religious people. This is something that I've faced all my life. I've decided very early on in my career that I never wanted to be the kind of academic who spends all of his time poring over the vowel markings of some, 8th century Akkadian text. What I wanted to do was take this information that I was learning, information that I found to be extraordinarily interesting, and to package it in an appealing and accessible way for everyone else to enjoy. I simply assumed that if I find this stuff interesting, other people would too. But you'd be amazed at the pushback that I have received from my colleagues in departments of religion around the world. The truth of the matter is that academics are not just discouraged from writing popular books, they're actually punished for it. To this day, I have young grad students tell me what they should do, how they should achieve, the kind of popular success that I've achieved. And my answer to them is get tenure first, because it doesn't help to have a New York Times best-selling book. It actually hurts you in academia. Now, I think this is changing. I think that young scholars especially, who are products of a media age, and particularly a digital media age, are becoming more adept at navigating social media, at navigating popular media. I think when you increasingly see historians of contemporary Russian history on Jon Stewart, joking and talking about Putin, young scholars see that and say, I can do that. I can write a book about my particular field that people outside of my field would enjoy. So it is changing for sure, but this general distrust of academics, of theologians, of scholars is something that really I blame ourselves for more than anything else.
How long did you work on Zealot?
Well, the writing of it 4 years, the research of it 2 decades. I mean, it really began with that first course in religious studies that I took at Santa Clara University, and the first time that a professor showed me the difference between a historical look at Jesus and a theological look at Jesus. And so I'd say about 2 decades of really delving deep into the origins of Christianity, but 4 years of writing.
Do you write at home, your office?
I have a home office. It was easier until my twin 2-year-olds arrived to write at home, and now I have to escape. I will go really anywhere that I can kind of have a few solid hours of uninterrupted work.
Coffee shop, I mean, when
coffee
you say
shop, absolutely, coffee shops. I now have an external office, which sometimes helps. As any writer will tell you, a book comes out, and if you're lucky and if it's a successful book, that results in a never-ending book tour. And so it's time for me to sit down and get to work on the next book.
From Zealot, 2,000 years later, the Christ of Paul's creation has utterly subsumed the Jesus of history.
Yes. I would say that of all the comments that I receive about Zealot, the one that is most common and most surprising is what happens in the decades immediately after Jesus' death, and this rivalry that pops up between Paul, the great preacher of Christianity to a Gentile audience, and a far lesser known, but perhaps more significant figure, James, the brother of Jesus, the flesh and blood brother of Jesus. Of course, some of your listeners may not be aware of this, but Jesus had 4 brothers, James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon, and an untold number of sisters who unfortunately are not named in the New Testament. One of his brothers, James, became the leader of the Jesus movement after Jesus' death. Indeed, the hand-picked, designated successor to Jesus. He was known as the Bishop of Bishops, the head of the Jerusalem Assembly, or church. They didn't use the word church back then, but assembly. The assembly that was in charge of all the other assemblies. James was, according to all the historical documents that we have at that time, the undisputed head of what can be called Christianity for a good 30 years after Jesus' death. Again, this is remarkable. Jesus was in charge of the Jesus movement for 3 years. James, his brother, was in charge of it for 30 years. And yet, he's been almost wholly written out of Christian history, and that's for a very understandable reason. James had what can only be described as a limited view of this new movement. He believed that this was a Jewish movement for Jews. James was okay if a non-Jew wanted to join this movement, as long as he became a Jew first. And until the year 57, that included circumcision. In the year 57, he removed circumcision as a requirement, but nevertheless maintained all the purity and dietary laws. This was, as far as James was concerned, a Jewish expression. Jesus was a Jew. He was preaching Judaism to other Jews, and so therefore, to follow Jesus truly, you had to follow the law of Moses, the Torah. Paul had a completely different view of this movement. Paul, of course, converted to the movement after Jesus' death, never met Jesus, never spoke to Jesus, but was in what he describes as direct communication with the risen Jesus. And he says the risen Jesus gave him a completely new message, a message of universalism. Not only did Paul say that you didn't have to follow the law of Moses, Paul said you shouldn't follow the law of Moses. He said that Christ was the end of the Torah, that this was a message, not only that it was not just for Jews, that it was for everyone. And in fact, to truly follow this new movement, you had to divorce yourself from Judaism. You had to become what Paul referred to as, quote, a new being, one that was neither Jew, nor Greek, nor Syrian, nor Arab, but something else entirely, part of a brand new creation, a new creation like Jesus was a new creation as far as Paul was concerned. Now, what I'm describing will sound very familiar to Christians because it's called Christianity. But what I think really surprises Christians to learn is that in the lifetime of these two men, James and Paul, Paul was an outcast. He was marginalized. He was a fringe figure. This version of Christianity that he was preaching was heterodox to say the least. Indeed, on numerous occasions, Paul was summoned to Jerusalem to answer for his heretical teachings about Christianity, and to answer directly to James. As I sometimes joke, you can't win an argument with James. How do you win an argument with the flesh and blood brother of Jesus? What are you going to say that's going to beat a man who can say, I bunked with Jesus, and that's not what he meant. You can't win an argument against the brother of Jesus. And so Paul lost that argument. Paul dies in the year 66. James dies in the year 62. And at that point, as I say, Paul's views are the minority view, to say the least. But here is the difference between Paul and James. James, like his brother Jesus, was an uneducated, illiterate peasant from the backwoods of Galilee. He never wrote anything down. He couldn't write anything down. Paul was an educated, urbanized, cosmopolitan Roman citizen from one of the wealthiest port cities in the empire, Tarsus. He wrote everything down. Everything that he believed, he wrote down. And so, with the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70, the death of both men, and the transformation of Judaism into no longer a distinctly Jewish religion, one that is being preached instead to Romans, what that generation of Christians discovered is a dozen or so letters from Paul outlining this vision for a universal version of Christianity, as opposed to the more ethno-nationalistic version of Christianity preached by James. And a man who was derided and disregarded in his own lifetime becomes in many ways the creator of what we now know as Christianity. Look at the New Testament. We have one letter by James. It wasn't written by James, it was written by his followers, but one letter by James, the undisputed leader of this movement, the brother of Jesus himself. We have two letters from Peter, the first of the apostles, the rock upon which Jesus built his church. We have three letters from John, the beloved disciple, one of the triumvirate that ruled over the early Christian movement along with Peter and James. And we have 11 letters from Paul. Indeed, nearly half the New Testament is either written by Paul or attributed to Paul or about Paul. And that tells you the enormous influence that this man ended up having. And look, if you're a Christian, for the better. I mean, I think a lot of people say, well, what if James had won? What if James had actually won that argument with Paul? Well, if that had happened, there would be no such thing as Christianity today. Let's just be honest. Christianity would be a small, probably insignificant Jewish sect somewhere in the Middle East. But James didn't win. Paul won. And Christianity became a universal religion that anyone could join regardless of their ethnicity or nationality or religious persuasion. And that religion has become the largest religion in the world.
What do we know about when and how the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were written?
A lot, actually. There's still a great deal of debate about some of the particulars, but the prevailing theory, the theory that I would say the overwhelming majority of scholars agree, goes something like this. Not long after Jesus' death, let's say 30, 33, somewhere around there, his teachings began to be spread around orally along his communities. Not his actions, again, his teachings, with the exception, of course, of the Last Supper, the crucifixion and the resurrection, which were liturgical events, so those were passed along. But what the disciples, what the followers of Jesus really cared about is the things Jesus said, not so much the things Jesus did. Eventually, sometime around the 50s, those teachings began to be written down. We don't have access to this document any longer. We refer to it cryptically as Q, which is from the German word Quelle, which means source. But imagine, if you will, sort of the Jesus quote book. That's what we're talking about. So this quote book existed sometime around the 50s. In the year 70, as a result of the Jewish revolt against Rome, Jerusalem is destroyed, the temple is destroyed, and the first church, the Church of James, is destroyed. Exists at this point are the letters of Paul and this hypothetical text that we call Q. Not long after 70 AD, indeed, maybe almost immediately after, sometime around 70, 71, 72, an early Christian, a Roman Christian by the name of John Mark, that's what we think he is, his name is anyway, in Rome, sits down and gives birth to this brand new genre called gospel. What he tries to do is he takes this sort of traditional biography, this sort of sacred biography of the Caesars, that is very common, and he adapts it to Jesus. And he writes the Gospel of Mark, as we now know it. Now, the Gospel of Mark is, for many Christians, an unsatisfying gospel. There is no infancy narrative. Jesus just all of a sudden shows up on the banks of the Jordan River to be baptized by John. There is no resurrection appearance in the original Gospel of Mark, which ends at chapter 16, verse 8. Jesus dies. He's buried in a tomb. 3 days later, women come to wash his body, and the tomb is empty. And there is a man in white who says, Jesus has been risen, go and tell the rest of the disciples, end of gospel. That, of course, becomes the first gospel, but as I say, it's somewhat unsatisfying, especially as Christianity starts to expand, become more Romanized, more Hellenistic. And so, about 20 years later, sometime between the years 90 and 100, two other gospel writers, Matthew and Luke, writing at a distance from each other, and interestingly, unbeknownst to one another, decide to, as it were, update Mark's gospel. So they take Mark's gospel, and they have at their disposal this other document, Q, the sayings of Jesus. And of course, they have their own traditions, their own individualistic, particular traditions. And they rewrite the gospel, and they fill in a lot of that, let's say, missing material. So there are all these infancy narratives. What happened to Jesus' early years before he was baptized? What about all these resurrection appearances? You know, all these stories that we have and that don't exist in Mark. And now you have the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. With Mark, they're called the synoptics because they very much read the same. They very much present a singular kind of narrative about Jesus, a singular chronology. About 10 years later, sometime between the years 100, perhaps even as late as 120, we have the fourth gospel, the Gospel of John. And that gospel is written at a time in which there is no longer anything Jewish about this religion. It has absolutely divorced itself from Judaism. Mark is a deeply Jewish text. Matthew and Luke still maintain sort of Jewish affinities. At the very least, they explain the Jewish things that Jesus does. John begins his gospel not with an infancy narrative, not with Jesus' miraculous birth to a virgin. It begins at the beginning of time. In arche in ha logos kai ha logos proston theon, John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Right away, John says something brand new. You see, Matthew, Mark, and Luke never, ever call Jesus God. Ever. They call Jesus the Son of God, which is actually a title, not a description. It's a title for kings. They certainly intimate that there is a divine quality to Jesus, and certainly post-resurrection there is a divine nature to Jesus, but at no point in these three Gospels does Jesus say, I am God. The first verse of John says, Jesus was not a man. He was an eternal, divine being who was responsible for creation. Now here's his story. So right away, what you see in John is something completely new, totally different. Now, what we know, of course, is that these 4 Gospels were not the only 4 Gospels, that there were many, many more Gospels that were written. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of the Egyptians. These Gospels were lost to us as a result of Constantine's Nicene Creed. All these other Gospels were eventually destroyed. Fortunately, we found them about 60 years ago in a village in Upper Egypt. We now refer to them as the Gnostic Gospels. And your readers, you can go to Barnes & Noble and buy copies of the Gnostic Gospels. They're quite fascinating. But nevertheless, what's important to understand about what I just said is 2 fundamental facts about the Gospels, and indeed about every word ever written about Jesus. Number 1, they were all written by people who never met or knew Jesus. Let me say that one more time. Every word ever written about Jesus, every word, was written by people who did not meet or know Jesus. His disciples were illiterate. They never wrote anything down. The first words about Jesus were written by Paul. He never met Jesus. The Gospel of Mark was not written by a man named Mark. These are not eyewitness accounts of Jesus' words and deeds. These are theological reflections about who Jesus was, written many years after Jesus' death. Matthew was not written by someone named Matthew. These are called pseudepigraphica. It's very common in the ancient world to title books in such a way to indicate that they are written by someone who knew the prophet, but in reality that's just an homage, if you will. With the exception of Luke. Luke very likely wrote the Gospel of Luke, but the rest of the Gospel writers these Gospels were not written by the people after whom they are named, in other words. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind when trying to figure out how to extract historical information from the Gospels. These were written by people who were the second and third generation of Christians, not the first generation.
And from Zealot, the kingdom of God is a call to revolution, plain and simple. The prophets, bandits, zealots, and messiahs of Jesus' time all knew this, which is why they did not hesitate to employ violence in trying to establish God's rule on earth. The question is, did Jesus feel the same way? There may be no more important question than this for those trying to pry the historical Jesus away from the Christian Christ. Barvell, Dallas, Texas, thanks for holding on. You're on with Reza Aslan.
Hello, thank you. It's Barville.
Thank you, sir.
I won't tell you, nothing would please me more than to sit down across a long dinner table with you, a couple of bottles of wine, and discuss these. I think you're brilliant, and I look forward to reading your books. I'm aware of your writings. I've worked in the Middle East on three different occasions over 20 years, from 1994 to now. I have some very strong viewpoints about Islam. I think I have just 2 things I know you have a lot to do and say today. How do you come to terms with the murder of some 600, 800 Jews that Muhammad participated in after the Battle of the Trench in around 630?
Very, very good question. I actually write a lot about this topic in No God But God. And of course, part of it has to do with this mythology that arises about Muhammad's time in Medina, a mythology that, depending on whether you're a Jew or a Christian or a Muslim, you're going to interpret in your own way. What I try to do is remove religion from the issue altogether and really analyze what was happening in Mecca and Medina at the time of Muhammad from a purely political and economic standpoint. In the case of Medina, you're talking about various tribes, Jewish, pagan, and Muslim, who are all living under a single constitution called the Constitution of Medina, which I talk about at length in the book. A constitution that required every signatory to defend Medina against the Meccan invasion. And many of the Jewish tribes did. But there was a tribe called the Banu Qurayza that in the middle of the Battle of the Trench changed sides. They actually decided to start fighting on behalf of the Meccans against the Medinans. Now, this wasn't the first time that a tribe had done something like that. It had happened a couple of times beforehand, and both times the punishment for those tribes was exile. And so those tribes, if they weren't going to defend Medina against its external enemies, were not allowed to live in Medina any longer. This third time, however, with the Banu Qurayza, the Prophet Muhammad, and by the way, it wasn't his decision, it was an arbitrator who arbitrated between them, decided that the punishment for treason against the Constitution would be that the men would all be killed, which was, of course, tribal justice. That's how it worked. Now, it's very important to understand that this tribe was killed not for religious reasons. In fact, Jewish tribes continued to live in Medina in harmony with the Muslim and pagan tribes for generations after the Prophet Muhammad's death. It was really not until the Caliph Umar in which the Jewish tribes were expelled from the Arabian Peninsula. But during the Prophet's lifetime, the Jews maintained very cordial relations with Muslims and with the Prophet Muhammad's community. Indeed, one great scholar, Nabia Abbott, has shown that for at least 200 years after the death of the Prophet, Muslims were required to read the Torah alongside the Quran as a single document. So it wasn't for religious reasons that the members of the Banu Qurayza tribe were executed. It was simply for treason. Now, you can say that's barbaric. You may be right. We are, of course, talking about the 7th century, and 7th century morality and is a little bit different than, I think, 21st century morality. And you can certainly judge the Prophet Muhammad for the actions of agreeing to the execution of his political enemies in Medina. But it's important to understand it as a historical event, not a religious event. That's, I think, what I would say about that.
Shirley emails into you, Professor Aslan. Please speak about why Muslims, such as yourself, do not forcefully speak out against the violence some Muslims carry out in the name of God.
How does Shirley know that I don't speak out against violence against, by Muslims? How does Shirley know that there are Muslims who do not speak out against violence? I'm going to tell you something. I'm going to let you in on a little secret. Shirley is not asking a question, okay? She's making a statement. And it's an absolutely false statement, one that is so empirically proven false. It would take 5 seconds for Shirley to do a Google search, and I'm just going to assume that Shirley has heard of Google, and she can just simply go to Google right now, Shirley, and punch in Muslim statements against violence. Try that. Try that for a moment. And what you will see is hundreds of thousands of fatwas, of declarations by institutions, by clerical groups, by individuals, by imams all over the world condemning violence in the name of Islam. Indeed, don't take their word for it. Go to Gallup, if you will. Gallup did a very interesting survey 2 years ago among American religious communities. They asked every religious community in the United States, including atheist groups, 10 simple questions about the use of violence. In all 10 questions, Muslims were by far the religious community that was least accepting of violence in the name of religion. In fact, by sometimes 20 to 30 points over Christians and Jews. In fact, the only community whose tolerance for, or lack of tolerance for violence came close to Muslims were atheists, as a matter of fact. This notion that I hear all the time, why aren't Muslims condemning violence, is absurd. In fact, as I say, it's not a question. You are not asking me a question, Shirley. You are just simply regurgitating something that you have been told over and over and over again, something that can be proven wrong with almost no effort on your part at all. So, instead of asking me that question, ask the question of yourself and find the answer.
From Reza Aslan's 2010 book, Beyond Fundamentalism, Confronting Religious Extremism in an Age of Globalization, he writes, by treating the global war on terror like a cosmic war, we have not only played into the hands of these radical Muslim militants, we may have set the groundwork for a new and terrifying age of religious war.
And I think we're there. As I said earlier, what these jihadists are fighting is a war of the imagination. I'm not saying that it's not bloody and brutal and catastrophic and destructive. It is. But it's not a war for land. It's not a war for money. It's not a war for political gain. It's a war for the triumph of good over evil. When we, in the United States, begin to adopt that same rhetoric, when we refer to the war against Al-Qaeda as a battle between good and evil, when we begin to infuse our political rhetoric with the same kind of theological rhetoric that one hears from these fanatics who are fighting these cosmic wars, we empower them. Because by adopting their language, we are also legitimating their worldview. We're saying, you're right. This is a battle between good and evil, except that we're good and you're evil. That is an unwinnable conflict. We have to understand that we will never out-fanaticize these fanatics. That on the contrary, what we need to do is bring this cosmic conflict back down to earth. We need to address the very real grievances that create support for these cosmic groups like Al-Qaeda, like ISIS. And we have to recognize, whether we want to hear this or not, that these militants, these Al-Qaeda militants, these ISIS militants, are not fighting a real war. In other words, they don't want anything concrete. What they want is unachievable in this world. And so the only response is their destruction. We must wipe out Al-Qaeda. We must wipe out ISIS. But it's not enough to just simply kill militants. We have to get rid of the ideology that supports them. And the only way to do that is to address the grievances that these militants use to draw people to their cause.
Ali Tirani emails in, what would happen to you in the airport if you decided to fly to Tehran tomorrow?
I'd be let in without any problem because I have, the proper paperwork. Whether I'd be let out, that's a different issue. Iran, and I hate to use this word, is a third world bureaucracy. And like most third world bureaucracies, there is no opportunity to appeal to some kind of rule or some kind of law. The law is in the hands of the bureaucrat sitting across from you. If he's had a bad day or if he's fought with his wife, you're not going home. If he's in a good mood, you are going home. You could protest all you want to. You could say, but I have the paperwork that says X, Y, and Z. It's not that kind of country. It's not the kind of country in which the rule of law is what matters. And so, look, I'll just be honest with you. It's a crapshoot. You show up in hopes that you can just sort of go under the radar, that nobody will notice, that people won't make a big deal, and that you'll get to leave. That's what happened to me my last trip there. And, when I go back, which I will certainly in a couple of years with my family, I just kind of cross my fingers.
Have you visited Israel?
Oh, many times. Yes, many times. I've been to Israel a large number of times. I've done research there. I've gone there for vacation. I've done a lot of work there. I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but I'm fairly well known in Israel. I've had a lot of articles written about me in Israel. As I say, my books have been published in Israel. And so I think people think that because I am very critical of this Israeli government, the government of Benjamin Netanyahu and the Likud party, and the disturbing right-wing lurch of the Knesset, that somehow that makes me anti-Israel. It's such a unsophisticated, way of talking. I mean, it's like saying that if I criticize American policy, then I'm anti-American, or if I criticize Barack Obama, then I'm racist. It's frankly idiotic. I think that the reason that I'm so critical of Israel is because I truly do believe in Israel. I do believe in the promise of what Israel was supposed to be, what it can be. But this 40-year brutal, unjust, immoral occupation of the Palestinian people, an occupation that is accelerating, not decelerating, an occupation that is nothing less than collective national suicide on the part of Israel itself, has sullied everything that Israel was supposed to be, everything that it sets itself up to be. And until that occupation is dealt with, then the promise of Israel is going to be nothing more than just a promise. It'll never be fulfilled.
What's it like going through Ben Gurion Airport?
Well, it's not easy as an Iranian. It certainly is not. I'm an American citizen, but it doesn't really help. As I say in Beyond Fundamentalism, I don't blame Israel for its paranoia. I mean, look, it's received a real battering by people who look just like I do. But I also understand that if Israel wants to truly have the peace and prosperity that it deserves, that most of its people want unconditionally, then it has to figure out a way to live side by side and in peace and in equality with its Palestinian neighbors and its Palestinian citizens. What is happening right now in Israel is an abomination. It's an abomination to human rights, to constitutionalism, to what we expect of a modern democratic state. But most of all, it's an abomination to everything that is true and good about Judaism and the Jewish people.
From Beyond Fundamentalism, the problem is not with Israel. The problem is with me, with the sum of my identities. My citizenship is American, my nationality Iranian, my ethnicity Persian, my culture Middle Eastern, my religion Muslim, my gender male, all the multiple signifiers of my identity. The things that make me who I am are in one way or another viewed as a threat to the endless procession of perfectly pleasant, perfectly reasonable immigration officers whose task it is to maintain a safe distance between people like them and people like me. Even so, throughout the entire exercise, I could not help but think of the famed French theorist Ernest Renan, who years ago defined the nation as, quote, a group of people united in a mistaken view about the past and a hatred of their neighbors. Nowhere is that sentiment borne out more fully or with more force than among the relatively new nations scattered along the broad horizon of the Middle East. Mary in Tucson, Arizona, you are on with Reza Aslan on Book TV on C-SPAN 2.
Hello. I'm really appreciating this very simple, extremely articulate conversation. Earlier in the program, you had mentioned that there is no completely wrong or completely right religion. And so my question for you is that, would that not exclude Christianity? Because Christ himself had said, I am the way, the truth, and the light. No man comes to the Father except through him, me, he said. So since Jesus is the very cornerstone of Christianity, would that not make Christianity completely wrong or completely right?
No, not at all. There are, of course, multiple ways to understand Jesus' saying that I am the way, the truth, the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. The first way to understand it is its historical way. I would say that it's not Jesus who said that, it's John who said that. That verse is from the Gospel of John, as I was talking about earlier. The Gospel of John, written sometime between 100 and 120 AD, has a completely different understanding of who Jesus was than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John, as I say, thinks Jesus is literally God, which is not what Matthew, Mark, and Luke say about Jesus. In the Synoptic Gospels, there is no phrase from Jesus in which he says that he is himself God, whereas he says this in John all the time. That doesn't mean it's incorrect. That's a faith statement. A Christian can be as much a Christian in believing that Jesus is literally God incarnate as he can be if he believes that Jesus is just a man. There are many, many Christians, Nestorians are one of them, the Arian Christians are many of them, who believe that Jesus was not God. By the way, there are many, many Christians who believe that Jesus was not a man. The Copts, for instance, in Egypt are monophysite Christians. They believe that Jesus was pure God, that he had no human nature whatsoever. So, that verse, which seems in your mind, in the minds of many, many Christians around the world, to be self-explanatory and to require no kind of interpretation, that it can only be understood in one way, in reality has been understood in hundreds and hundreds of different ways. So, I ask you again, how do we decide which way is right? How do we decide which interpretation of that saying is correct and which is not? Now, I would posit that there is no way to decide, that there is no arbitrator, there is no one who gets to say your interpretation is correct and that person's interpretation is incorrect. Religion becomes a deeply individualistic thing, which is, of course, why there are so many different sects and schisms of all religious traditions. That may seem uncomfortable. I totally get it. I really understand why that statement may make people of faith uncomfortable, because there is something comforting in believing that what you believe, your particular interpretation of Scripture, is the correct one. In fact, it's the only one. And that anyone else who interprets that verse differently is simply wrong. That's a comforting thought, but it's historically inaccurate. It's empirically inaccurate, unless you believe that just you and anyone who agrees with you is a Christian and anybody who doesn't agree with you is not a Christian, and I'm certain, Mary, that you don't believe that. So we have to come to the opposite conclusion, which is that every one of the multiple ways in understanding that verse are equally valid. Maybe they're not equally reasonable, maybe they're not equally historically accurate, but they're equally valid.
Majib is calling in from Lancaster, California. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, sir. First of all, I would like to commend you on the distinction you made earlier between the popular concept of religion and faith. I am from Africa, so I have a little bit of a thick English accent. If you don't understand anything, you can always ask me to repeat it.
I understand you perfectly.
All right. So my question is simple and short. In Islam, there is this notion that's inferred from the Quran that there is no compulsion in religion. Yet we know what happens when, in some countries, people try to, I don't know how you proselytize or convert from
right.
Islam to another religion. Is it that this notion, this concept of there is no compulsion in religion, does it not have any significant meaning in Islam?
Of course it does. But that meaning is, once again, contingent upon whatever your political or social or cultural persuasions may be. You're right. The Quran says in black and white, there can be no compulsion in religion, to you your religion, to me my religion. Indeed, as I said earlier, the Quran over and over again calls Jews and Christians part of the Ummah, part of the larger community, what I refer to as monotheistic pluralism. It validates the Torah and the Gospels, but you wouldn't believe that, you wouldn't know that if you listen to a lot of Muslims talk about Christians or Jews. This is the problem with Scripture, is that it can mean whatever you want it to mean. Why is it that we still pay attention to writings that were composed 5,000 years ago? It's not because they are true, although their truth has very little to do with the facts that they espouse. It's because they are infinitely malleable. The Torah addresses every aspect of the human condition. The same Torah that says, love your neighbor as yourself, also says, slaughter every man, woman, and child that does not believe in Yahweh. The same gospel that says, turn the other cheek, also says that Jesus did not come to preach peace. He came to preach the sword. The same Quran that says there can be no compulsion in religion, that if you kill one person, it is as though you have killed all of mankind, also says, find and slay the believer wherever you may find them. You see, Scripture can mean anything you want it to mean because it has everything in it that you need. If you are a misogynist, you will find plenty of evidence in all the Scriptures to validate your view. If you are a feminist, you will find plenty of material in the same Scripture to validate your view. If you are a believer in peace, you can use the Quran, the Gospels, and the Torah to argue your view. If you are a believer in war, you could use the same exact Scriptures to argue your view. This becomes fundamentally a problem that, there is a conflict between the Scripture and interpretation, the way that we approach Scriptures. So, unfortunately, it becomes almost impossible to appeal to Scripture when trying to argue against misogyny, against totalitarianism, against violence, because those who espouse those views can simply use the same Scripture to argue for them. Instead, all we can do is argue our particular interpretation with the same full-throated confidence as the misogynists and the warmongers do. I think for a lot of people, they would say, well, look, if religion is responsible for these acts of violence, then let's just get rid of religion and the violence will go away. But no sophisticated person actually believes that to be the case. If you want to combat religious bigotry, you need religious pluralism. If you want to combat religious violence, you need religious peace, religious tolerance. If you want to combat religious hatred, you need religious love. So it depends on all people of faith around the world to really latch on to those aspects of their religion that promote compassion and tolerance and love and peace, and to argue for those views, for those values, with the same intensity as the extremists argue for their particular interpretations.
Dr. Ali Ibrahim emails in to you, Dr. Aslan. It is interesting to listen to your interpretations of religions and your beliefs. What is your position on who are the International Muslim Brothers movement and what they are doing all over the Middle East?
If you're referring to the Muslim Brotherhood, I think it's important not to view them as an international movement. Yes, there are Muslim Brothers in Tunisia and in Egypt. Hamas used to be part of a Muslim Brotherhood organization. One can say that even the ruling AK party in Turkey had its roots in the Muslim Brotherhood. There are Muslim Brothers in Saudi Arabia. There are Muslim Brothers in Venezuela. But it is a mistake to think that these different groups represent one giant connected umbrella organization. They do not. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt has nothing to do with the Muslim Brotherhood in Turkey. or the Muslim Brotherhood, even in neighboring Tunisia. Again, the Muslim Brotherhood is an Islamist organization. And as I mentioned earlier, Islamism is a nationalistic ideology. It is solely concerned with the nation state. That's why when you hear scholars and media professionals refer to the Muslim Brotherhood, they will always say the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, or the Tunisian Muslim Brotherhood, or the Algerian Muslim Brotherhood, because they are different. The Algerian Muslim Brotherhood only cares about Algeria. They couldn't care less about Egypt. The Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood only cares about Egypt. They don't care about Turkey. Their concerns are nationalistic. Jihadism, the opposite of Islamism, jihadism is a transnational organization. That's a movement that can be seen as having a kind of umbrella ideology, even when they are against each other. I've mentioned ISIS and Al-Qaeda a couple of times because those are the two most famous jihadist organizations, but what is really fascinating is that they hate each other, that ISIS and Al-Qaeda actually see each other as the enemy. ISIS began as an Al-Qaeda movement, but was divorced from Al-Qaeda because it was too violent, too extreme, even for Al-Qaeda, if you can imagine that.
Next call for you comes from Andrea in Palm Springs, California. Hi, Andrea.
Yes, hello. Thank you for the privilege of talking to you, Professor. I just have a comment or a question here. Have you any thoughts on the emerging studies in neuroscience that are indicating there may be a hard wiring in the brain for one to be predisposed to either fundamentalist or conservative beliefs and behaviors versus a the liberal shades of gray type mentality, and how that might impact the concept of faith?
Yes, very good. So there are actually two emerging studies, and they're interconnected but sort of separate. One of them says that the very conception of faith experience, is a product of chemical inducements in the brain. And indeed, there have been multiple studies in which those chemicals were affected by scientists to produce a spiritual experience. Connected to that are these other studies that show that there may be a genetic component, that it's maybe even hardwired in our DNA, that predispose us to extreme beliefs, what could be termed fundamentalism, if you'd like, as opposed to more skeptical, or perhaps one can even say, as you put it, more liberal beliefs. Let me address these two studies separately, because they are scientific studies. They are absolutely true. There's no reason to deny them whatsoever. But I don't think that we should exaggerate the significance of them. To the first one, what you hear from a lot of secular-minded people, scientists, so-called new atheists, is that this notion that faith can be proved to be a chemical experience therefore denies the reality of faith, that it means that religion and faith is nothing more than a human construct, and so it doesn't need to be taken seriously any longer. That is kind of a ridiculous statement. After all, every experience without exception is a result of chemical experiences. Everything that you see, feel, understand, everything that happens to you, everything that you know or have ever experienced is a result of chemicals in your brain. Love, faith, these are of course a result of chemical experiences. I don't understand why knowing the mechanism whereby one has an ecstatic experience negates the experience. That doesn't make any sense at all. Of course it's a chemical experience. Everything is a chemical experience. So that's my thought on the first study. The second study, I think, goes to what I've been saying all along about identity, that religion is not about the things you do or the things that you believe. It's about how you define yourself. And much in the same way that you may be predisposed to certain worldviews because of, say, the world in which you live, the culture out of which you arose, your DNA, your genetics is also going to have a great impact on your identity. So again, it's not, I don't think, surprising or unusual that how you interpret Scripture, whether you interpret it more liberally or more conservatively, how you experience your faith, whether you do so in much more extreme ways or in more sort of, let's say secular ways, has as much to do with nurture as it does with nature. I don't think that that's unusual, but I do think it's important not to go to extremes in trying to interpret this scientific data. It doesn't really say anything about the legitimacy of faith. It just says the mechanism whereby people experience faith.
Sandra Fox tweets in, will you be writing a book tracing Muhammad leading to the writing of the Quran?
Well, that's what No God But God is. That's what my first book is about, the historical Muhammad, the world that gave birth to Muhammad and the world that he left behind. So if you are interested in that topic, I suggest No God But God.
Are you working on another book?
I am, or I'm supposed to be working on another book. Let me put it that way. Yes, I am. I am working on a book that is about the very origins and evolution of our very concept of God. I've been fascinated with the origins of religion for a very long time. No God But God is about the origins of Islam. Zealot is about the origins of Christianity. But what I'd like to do now is to expand that search and talk about the very origins of God, the origins of religion. So I'm going back about 125,000 years and starting with the sort of first trace, the first notion that there is something beyond, something other than this world, and how that notion eventually became what we now call God.
Jeremy, Lawrence, Kansas, you are on Book TV on C-SPAN 2. Please go ahead.
Thank you, C-SPAN, so much for the time and space to have such a thorough thinker elucidate his open-hearted ideas. So I want to get your take, Mr. Aslan, on my assertion as a Jewish American religion major that what has come of Islamic jihadism is very similar to what was done to the historical Jesus's offering of both rooting out the corruption within his own group and offering a spiritual alternative to the Roman Empire. And that became a Constantinian, a co-opted form of the Jesus narrative by the Roman Empire and what ultimately became Zionism, Jewish and Christian Zionism. And so similarly, I wonder whether you think that it's similar that jihadism has actually been utilized by the empires of the West and the Jewish and Christian Zionists to divide the natural alliance between Islamists and Arab nationalists, and the natural alliance with progressives in the West. And what we see is that the war on terror is not constructed in the Middle East, in Afghanistan or in Iraq. It was constructed in many ways in Tel Aviv, in London, in Washington, D.C., and we can actually see that it is a greater Israel plan, and the usage of what are assets of Western imperialism, including Al-Qaeda, including ISIS, to be used to destroy the alliance of Islamists and Arab nationalists.
All right, Jeremy, a lot there.
Yeah, it's a very sophisticated question, Jeremy. It is true that jihadism as an ideology is an attempt at a sort of puritanical conception of Islam. Jihadism's theological roots, of course, go back to a particularly Saudi sect of Islam called Wahhabism. Wahhabism, which started in the 1800s, is I suppose the best way to put it is an ultra-puritanical idea. It's a notion that says that Islam has been corrupted by its various sects and variants, and that it has to be returned to some sort of unadulterated, perfected, and frankly totally imaginary past. Wahhabism, as any student of contemporary history knows, was exploited by the British to take control over the oil of the Arabian Peninsula. It was exploited by the CIA to fight the Soviets during the Cold War, in particular in Afghanistan. And it really, gave birth to Al-Qaeda as we know it, which then came back and bit us in the butt, as it always does when you think that you can control religious extremism for your own purposes. But you're right in that this notion that I'm just going to continue to referring to as puritanicalism is a widespread phenomenon in Christianity, in Judaism. This notion that the way that most people understand Judaism and that most people understand Christianity is wrong, and it has to be returned to some perfected, idealized past. We hear this all the time in religious traditions. And so I think that there is a great deal of connectivity in that regard. You're also right in that American foreign policy has, over the last 2 decades, benefited from promoting these kinds of transnational organizations. Perhaps not necessarily against Islamist groups, but certainly for our own needs and desires. I told you earlier that I would trace the origins of jihadism to about 1989, 1990 and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, because if you recall, what we did with coordination with the Saudis and the Pakistanis is collect failed Islamists from all around the Middle East, from Syria, from Lebanon, from Palestine, from Egypt and other parts of North Africa, and ship them to Afghanistan in order to fight the Soviets. Well, in Afghanistan, they did something remarkable. They won. They beat one of the 2 superpowers in the world. How did they do it? They did it by putting away their nationalistic ambitions and focusing as a global force. It didn't matter if you were Syrian fighting for Syria or Egyptian fighting for Egyptian. These were Syrians and Egyptians fighting side by side for Afghanistan, not against their own governments, but against a far enemy, and it worked. And that's where Al-Qaeda was born, by that victory. The idea that if you set aside your nationalistic concerns, if you come together as a global force and have a transnational or global agenda, then you can succeed. That was born in the battlefields of Afghanistan thanks to American foreign policy. So all of those things are correct. That said, let's not bog ourselves down in kind of moral equivalency arguments. There is no moral equivalency between a group like ISIS, which is slaughtering men, women, and children, crucifying people, cutting off heads, really taking part in what can only be described as ethnic cleansing of the Shia in Iraq. I mean, a genocide is what they are taking part in, with even the worst extremists in Israel or the worst extremists in the United States. Sure, the religious sentiment may be the same, but let's be careful about the way that we ascribe any kind of moral equivalency when it comes to actions.
Tom Lindo, Tucson, Arizona, email. What is your advice on how to respond to or deal with the jihadists as you define them?
So as I say in Beyond Fundamentalism, it's a 2-pronged attack. Number 1, understand that there are very real, legitimate grievances that these groups have and that they use to draw people to their side. Address those grievances in order to take away the propaganda value, in order to take away what is appealing about these jihadist movements. Address those grievances and you remove their audience. But the fighters themselves, the couple of thousand or so, according to the CIA, couple of thousand members of Al-Qaeda, the perhaps 10,000 or so members of ISIS, though about 1,000 of them are currently embroiled in the war in Iraq. These individuals do not have real grievances. They exploit the grievances of people in Iraq and Syria and in large parts of the Middle East in order to draw people to their side, but they themselves are not fighting a real war, as I've said. They are fighting a cosmic war. They don't want anything concrete. They don't have any kind of measurable goals. What they want is the world. What they want is to remove all nation states, all borders, all boundaries, and to reconstitute the planet as a single thing under their control. That is laughable. That is an impossible goal to achieve. And by the way, they know it's impossible, which is why, despite widespread perception in the West, they never talk about those goals. They never talk about the global caliphate. We talk about the global caliphate. They never talk about their agenda, their ultimate goals, because their agenda, their ultimate goals are laughably impossible to achieve. Instead, they focus their agenda on the celestial plane. They talk about the triumph of good over evil, the battle between darkness and light, between the angels of truth and the demons of darkness. And that kind of rhetoric really rings true to people. But when you are a military force that is not interested in land, not interested in politics, not interested in economic gain, when you are fighting a war of the imagination, there is no room for negotiation. There's no room for discussion. How do you have a conversation with someone who wants the world? You don't. The militants of Al-Qaeda, the militants of ISIS require a singular response: destruction. That's it. That's the only way to deal with them. But what's important to understand is that simply killing these militants does not do away with jihadism. The way to do away with jihadism is to tackle the root grievances that give it sustenance. And that includes a more robust engagement with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a more social and economic progress for Sunnis in Iraq, for instance, a greater emphasis on political participation and political freedoms in the Middle East. All of these things have to be addressed in the political realm in order to remove that which is appealing about jihadism. But jihadists themselves, there is only one response to them.
From No God But God, fundamentalism in all religious traditions is impervious to suppression. The more one tries to squelch it, the stronger it becomes. Counter it with cruelty, and it gains adherents. Kill its leaders, and they become martyrs. Respond with despotism, and it becomes the sole voice of opposition. Try to control it, and it will turn against you. Try to appease it, and it will take control. David Felty emails in to you, Professor Aslan. I am surprised how literalistic and dualistic Reza Aslan is. Few experts in literary criticism in the last 50 years would accept his absolutist bifurcation between history and faith, history versus religious, and historical versus theological.
I'm not sure where he has studied, but that's really the foundation of religious studies. I mean, I just have to say that, you know, day one of religious studies is understanding the difference between sacred history and regular history, understanding the difference between faith and religion, understanding the difference, of course, between faith and history. So I would just have to say I humbly disagree.
Tisa Garrison, My dream in depth would be a discussion between Dr. Aslan and Dr. Michael Shermer. Have you ever appeared on a venue with him?
As a matter of fact, I've appeared on a couple of venues with him. He, like myself, we're both Angelinos. I like Michael Shermer. He's a famous skeptic. I think he's the editor-in-chief of a magazine called Skeptic, of course. I think skepticism is great, but skepticism can itself become a kind of ideology. In fact, this is probably my greatest complaint about the so-called new atheist movement. I'm not saying Michael Shermer is a new atheist, but I'm referring to this movement that has become very popularized by people like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and the late Christopher Hitchens. My biggest problem with the new atheist movement, frankly, is that it gives atheism a bad name. I mean, understand that some of my greatest intellectual heroes are atheists, but they're philosophical atheists. Schopenhauer, Feuerbach, even Huxley, who would call himself an agnostic. But nevertheless, I think that atheism is different than what these new atheists are ascribing to. I refer to the new atheism as scientism. It's an attempt to replace religion with science, which, by the way, should send a chill up the spine of every scientist, because that's not the role of science, to replace religion. More importantly, however, it's become a new kind of religion itself, indeed a new kind of fundamentalist religion. I mean, I'm not the first person to note the strange parallels between religious fundamentalism and atheist fundamentalism. They both have this intense sense of siege. When you hear atheists talk, they're constantly talking about how their rights are being trampled upon and how they are under siege by a religious society, which is not exactly, I think, true. Just because, you know, your money says "In God we trust," it doesn't mean that you are under siege. They have a far more literalistic reading of Scripture than any literalist I know. Sam Harris is quite famous for this. I mean, he really reads the Scriptures in the most literalist sense, and then if he is confronted by people of faith who don't have the same literalist view of the Scripture that he does, he simply says that they're not really Jews, they're not really Christians, they're not really Muslims, because they don't take their Scripture literally. And certainly they have the same sense of sole access to the truth. That is the fundamentally, or I should say, the defining characteristic of fundamentalism. For many of these new atheists, particularly Richard Dawkins, a person of faith is not just wrong, he's stupid. That anyone who disagrees with him is not just incorrect, but dumb. That religion itself is nothing more than pure evil, as Christopher Hitchens used to like to say. That religion is responsible for all the evil in the world, and so therefore religion has to be excised from humanity to achieve peace and prosperity. Well, as I reminded Christopher Hitchens when he was alive, the most bestial acts of human destruction over the last 100 years, perhaps in all of human history, have been in the last 100 years, and they have all been in the name of unabashedly, avowedly secularist ideologies. Stalinism, Maoism, communism, Marxism, Nazism. These are all secular ideologies, and indeed in the case of Maoism and Stalinism and Marxism, they're anti-religious ideologies, and these are ideologies that have been responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of people in the last 100 years. So religion doesn't have a monopoly on violence. Let's just not forget that.
Under the title, Another Response to Reza's Diatribe Against Shirley, and you'll have 30 seconds to answer this, and I apologize for that. I did, as Professor Aslan suggested, and Googled Muslim statements against violence and found nothing.
Can I use the word BS on TV?
We're cable.
Really? You Googled the phrase Muslim statements against violence, and you didn't see the Council for American Islamic Relations the Islamic Society for North America, the Muslim British Council, the Grand Mufti of Iraq, the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia, the Grand Ayatollah in Iraq. You didn't hear the American Society for Muslim Advancement. None of those things came up in your Google search. I think there's something wrong with your Google.
Reza Aslan has been our guest for the past 3 hours on Book TV's In Depth. No God But God, The Origins, Evolution, and Future of Islam. Came 5, Beyond Fundamentalism. Originally called How to Win a Cosmic War, came out in 2010. The international bestseller Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth, came out last year. You've been watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2. Professor Aslan, thank you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.